Hello, good evening. Britain's miners, where there's been a vote, have been voting heavily against going on strike over pit closures. We have the details of the area results that are known so far, and hear what a group of miners in one of those areas, the South Derbyshire coalfield, have to say. As the miners' strike, it looks as if most of the men who voted on whether or not to join the strike have decided to carry on working, threatening the national leaders' hopes of a national stoppage. The results from 3 areas have been announced in the last 2 hours, and all have voted against the strike. Other developments: the National Coal Board is to take the executive of the Yorkshire miners back to court for ignoring a court order to withdraw the flying pickets. The case will be heard on Monday. If the union is found to be in contempt and stays in contempt, the Yorkshire area could in theory face unlimited fines. And British Rail has warned its drivers they'll be fired if they refuse to cross a picket line. 3 areas have announced the outcome of their ballots today, and we're expecting a result from Northumberland this evening. The ballot paper in each area had the same question on it. Do you support strike action to prevent pit closures and the massive rundown? The turnout was high, averaging 87.5%. The first result in came from Lancashire, widely regarded as an accurate reflection of the miners' mood in the less militant coalfields. There, the vote against the strike was 3-2. With almost 2,600 of the area's miners in favour of joining the strike and more than 3,700 against. In the Midlands area, where most men have worked this week, the vote was almost 3-1 against. Nearly 3,000 backed the strike, but more than 7,500 were against it. And in the South Derbyshire area, the vote against the strike was even more overwhelming. Only 453 wanted to come out, and more than 2,303 voted to stay at work. It also looks as if the Nottingham coalfield, the second largest in Britain, will decide against joining the strike. Their vote is announced tomorrow, and it's believed to be running 4-1 against. But some area leaders have already said that despite the vote, they'll instruct their members not to cross picket lines.
Some Nottinghamshire miners defied their leaders and went to work. The officials had promised the Yorkshire flying pickets that there'd be no work until after the ballot, and on the strength of that agreement, the Yorkshiremen pulled out. As soon as they'd gone, the drift back to work started. It seemed the picketing had been counterproductive.
And I'm pretty sure that at the beginning of the last week, we've got a lot of our members who are in support of us. But I'm afraid that the events that's taken place over the last week, some of them will think again and will vote the other way, unfortunately. And this is what we forecast would happen. And we warned the Yorkshire lads that it would only be counterproductive, and I think that's what it's going to be.
The story was much the same in Staffordshire. Miners at this pit defied the pickets and clocked in. As the men voted heavily in favour of working, their officials warned them that whatever the vote, they should not cross picket lines.
We don't cross picket lines. That was the view of the council.
So if one picket from anywhere turns up at any pit, they can't go to work even though they've voted to do so?
We do not usually cross picket lines. That's been the solidarity of the union. And apart from that, we are sending up to National a recommendation to reconvene the NEC as soon as possible and reconsider the decision they've made, because the council have said it is creating anarchy within the union.
Pressure is growing for the union executive to think again. Leaders of both the Durham and the South Derbyshire miners were tonight calling for a national ballot.
Rawdon Colliery is the largest pit in South Derbyshire. It employs 1,000 men. This morning, the majority of miners on the picket line were local. Most of the flying pickets from Yorkshire had left, and the atmosphere was good-humoured. Last night, however, there were ugly scenes when some pickets from outside the area sabotaged the colliery by pouring water over electrical equipment, which washes the coal from Rawdon and 2 other local collieries. Although Rawdon is not producing coal at the moment, the Derbyshire miners reacted angrily, and the local union condemned the sabotage.
But it's something that we should not condone. Intimidation is against the democratic society in which we live, and it should be condemned at all times.
Do you think they knew what they were doing, that they were actually sabotaging the plant?
I think if it is true that they did sabotage the plant, they must have known what they were doing.
The Yorkshiremen who remained on the picket line this morning were using verbal persuasion on their colleagues. What are you doing here this morning?
Just trying to lobby for support, trying to get these lads to back us.
Do you think you're going to get support?
Yes! Yeah. Well, what some say yes, some say no. One lad up there says 60-40 against it.
But most of the Derbyshire men wanted to continue to work.
Well, I think it'll be overwhelmingly to work, because it's always been a moderate area, so, I mean, we can appreciate the Yorkshire lads and that coming down and what they want to, you know, to get some kind of action, but it's always been the same round here. It's moderate. I'll say it'll be about well over 75% to work.
The vote continued peacefully, and by lunchtime the ballot box from Rawdon had arrived at the local union headquarters, closely followed by boxes from 4 other collieries in the area. 89% of the miners voted, a total of nearly 3,000 men. It took staff at the union just 2 hours to count the votes before Ken Toon announced the result.
Of that vote, 453 voted yes and 2,303 voted no. That was a vote of no representing 83.5%.
And it's a decision the Derbyshire men are determined to uphold. The test will come at 9:30 tonight, when the first shift begins at Rawdon. Jane Corbin, ITN, Derbyshire.
And now Jane Corbin in the flesh, seeking the views of a group of South Derbyshire miners in a miners' welfare hall near Burton-on-Trent.
Eric, can I ask you first, how did you vote today?
I voted to work, though.
Why is that?
Because, like the majority of folks, I'd imagine, they don't want to strike. They've all got mortgages, that and other. They're going to shut pits anyway, no matter what. Cadley Hill on the verge of closing now. There's an heating on. There's a fire. If we go on strike, it'll shut down any minute.
Can I ask you, how did you vote today?
Not to strike, to carry on working.
And why was that?
Because the thing is, a lot of the tactics that are being used are sort of undemocratic, and should we have a national vote, then if they're in favour of strike action, the men of South Derbyshire will uphold it. But as it is, we're being forced against our will, not, you know, they're wanting to strike and God knows what, and we just don't want to know.
Are you talking about the flying pickets when you talk about tactics?
Basically, yes, and I'm not happy how the executive have gone about it, because democracy is what this country's about, and we're just not seeing it.
Tom, can I ask you how you voted today?
Well, I voted to support the lads.
You did?
I did.
And
yes.
why was that?
Because I feel that they've got a grievance, a very strong grievance. We haven't felt it round here, but I sympathise wholeheartedly with them in Yorkshire and in Wales and all the rest of the country. As yet, we haven't felt it here, but it is coming to us as well in the very near future, and I wish people would realise that and accept it, that we are going to be the next ones to close before very long, and there is no other work that we can go to, and all these young lads that they've recruited in this here plan for coal, they are now letting down by closing the pits and taking the jobs away from them.
Carl, can I ask you at the back how you voted today?
I voted to carry on working.
So you don't agree with what Don says?
I do to a certain extent, but I should like to know where all these Yorkshire miners were when they've been closing the pits around this area. They've not been down here to support us. Same as Eric says, our pit will close itself if we're out on strike, and I think we've got to look after his own jobs as well as everybody else's. It's no us coming out in support with them and not having a job to come back to ourselves.
Well, your result is very clear. 83% of you voted to carry on working. But Nick, does that mean that you're going to cross picket lines? Because there's obviously going to be some opposition. Are you prepared to cross a picket line in defence of that?
I think Eric's quite right to add a little bit more to what's already been said. Eric's quite correct when he says that we haven't really felt the effects of the overtime ban yet. And I feel that although the management and men have been perfectly fair and bent over backwards in the South Derbyshire area, I think that the Coal Board could have pushed the luck with the men in Scotland and South Yorkshire, probably hoping to achieve just what we've seen. it's a dilemma. It's going to be a dilemma. I mean, Ken Toons said that a lot of people are going to have a lot of things on their mind when they approach those picket lines, and personally, I wouldn't cross a picket line.
Eric, what about you? You're obviously forceful on this issue. Are you going to cross a picket line? I mean, Mr. Scargill has said that he doesn't expect miners to cross
I'm not
picket
in agreement
lines.
with these terror tactics what the flying pickets are using. I'm in favour of going an organised lot of men who want to work and going together.
And do you think you'll get across that picket line?
Well, if there's going to be trouble, there's going to be trouble. I mean, if South Derbyshire area can cross a picket line, and there's a lot of pickets, other areas will probably follow suit.
Carl, you're going to go across that picket line?
I'm on nights. I crossed the picket line last night and I've crossed again tonight. Until we've had chance to vote nationally.
Yes, national ballot, yes.
If we vote to come out on strike, the Yorkshire miners won't need to come down into this area because we'll be picketing. But until such time, I'm crossing until I've had a chance to say whether or not Arthur Scargill's taking money out of my pay packet or not.
Well, Don, you obviously disagree with that.
I do not condone the action that these here lads are taking from Yorkshire, not one little bit, because I don't want to see this sort of thing, a miner against miner. At the end of the day, we're all in the same industry, and it does not do anybody any good to get in this sort of tactics. But I think that the coal board could have been a little bit more diplomatic and understanding and stop this sort of thing before it got to this stage. Because this has started long ago, and who has put the fuse to it? Mrs. Thatcher, by bringing McGregor in to do the job.
Well, you say Mrs. Thatcher, but Carl, who do you think's caused this?
The National Executive.
The union?
Yeah.
No.
No, there's been unrest from
If you watch
Russell.
Channel 4, or you have watched Channel 4 in the past, you'll have seen a film called Harlan County, USA, which perfectly documents American mining tactics, the McGregor style of mine management. And to my way of thinking, I don't like his patronising our people. Arthur Scargill uses the words our people, but I voted for him to put him where he is.
Well, talking of Arthur Scargill, do you think that he can now withstand calls for a national ballot?
Probably not. Probably not.
From this area, anyway.
We would like a national ballot. We want a national ballot, yes.
We're paying into the union as well as the Yorkshire miners.
I think before long there will have to be a national ballot.
How soon?
We would like one immediately.
Immediately.
If they can draw one up, let's have one next week.
Let us get things down into basics and all get together instead of falling apart against one another.
What we don't
gentlemen,
want to see
I'm sorry,
is,
I'm going to have to stop you on that call for an immediate national ballot. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Some views from South Derbyshire which voted heavily against strike action. We've heard, in fact, in the last few minutes that the Northumberland miners have voted by a narrow margin for a strike. The first figures released by the union show that 52% were in favour of coming out and 48% against. The Northumberland executive say they'll continue picketing the pits in their area and they're to call for a national ballot. A national ballot, incidentally, requires an overall 55% vote for strike action for it to go ahead.
Now, on BBC One at 9:03, the news with John Humphreys.
The votes that say no to a strike, the miners' leaders must think again. Good evening. Miners in 3 of the country's coalfields have voted heavily against the strikes urged on them by their union leaders. Tonight, the Northumberland miners came out narrowly in favour, but the result overall has put great pressure on the union leaders to call a national ballot and let all the miners vote. The majority against the strike was more than 4-1 in South Derbyshire, and in the Midlands almost as big. But it was closer than expected in the traditionally moderate Lancashire coalfield, just 3-2 against. The vote supporting the strike in Northumberland was just below the 55% needed to authorise a strike. Union leaders there want a national ballot. Tonight, almost every pit in the country is at a standstill, many of them shut by flying pickets. Today, the Coal Board got permission to take the Yorkshire miners back to court for contempt because they broke an injunction banning their flying pickets. The Yorkshire NUM could face an unlimited fine or the seizure of its assets, and they're worth almost £8 million. But the Yorkshire Miners' president, Jack Taylor, said his men will continue to carry out their union duties. He told them, "You're doing a magnificent job." But it's the activities of the pickets that seems to have prompted many miners to vote against a strike.
The overwhelming ballot against the strike had been expected. The result, at least from moderate coalfields with a tradition of voting against strike action, had never been in doubt. But the size of today's majorities, here in South Derbyshire, 83%, now puts the union under even more pressure to think again about the strike and perhaps to allow a national pithead ballot.
The National Union of Mine Workers during this last few weeks have become disunited, area against area and man against man, and it is essential that one of the priority that we bring the miners of this country together again without ripping each other apart.
At this hotel, miners' leaders gathered to consider the implications of another big majority vote against striking. 72% of the Midlands miners.
And this result, now from our people, their voice has been heard, the national executive will have to take heed to the Midlands area, and we're asking them to be recalled and that they call a national ballot and clear the whole mess up.
There was some limited production today in the Nottinghamshire coalfields, despite the 24-hour stoppage, the result of a truce between the miners and the flying pickets, who went home so that a strike ballot could be held free from intervention. It's been a delicate, uneasy truce, and now that the Nottinghamshire ballot is over and the result soon to be declared, the underlying fear remains of a return by the Yorkshire flying pickets and of further violence, because all the indications are that Nottinghamshire miners, appalled by the recent violence, have voted by a majority to reject a strike.
Lancashire are against a strike, but not as much as some expected. 59.1% rejected the call. That's 6-4 against. Scenes like this had swung it. 100 Yorkshire pickets blockading a Lancashire pit. Inside damage that's still being costed, done by pickets during the night. Mob rule, local colliers called it. They wanted to go to work.
I've been here since 5:30 this morning to come to work. I ain't coming to work, not to picket my own pit.
But their officials, afraid of bloodshed, closed the pit instead. Pickets left in triumph, but warned if the ballot did go against them, they'd return on Monday.
We'll be back. The next spot is them, look there, I tell you for. The next spot is that there, in Yorkshire. Wait till we get round to them, don't you worry.
There's obvious satisfaction here at the Coal Board with the way the ballots have gone, and with even Northumberland calling for a national ballot, the hope here is that there will soon be one. But the board is still determined to go to court on Monday to seek damages from the Yorkshire area. It sees that as a way of bringing pressure to ensure that its employees can go to work if they wish. But today has still been the day in which the strike has bitten hardest in the coalfields, and the Coal Board has badly needed a break after a week in which it's been the union's militants who have made the running. The pattern of the week had been of steadily increasing success for strikers in closing down pits. From Monday, when nearly half the country's pits were still producing, the figure has plummeted every day to come down to a mere handful. After weekend meetings, many miners were still trying to go to work early in the week. But today, 4 days later, there's scarcely a coalfield in the country where work's going on at all. The reason is plain to see. The most extensive mass picketing since the steel strike and probably since the 1972 miners' strike. It's been on a scale the police and the new government legislation has so far been unable to cope with. There's little sign here of the provisions of the Pryor and Tebbit Employment Acts of 1980 and 1982, which made picketing away from your place of work unlawful and proposed limits on numbers to a suggested figure of 6. The question now is whether the ballot votes will be more successful in moderating the action. The position is that most of the pickets come from the 5 areas which have not balloted their members in recent weeks over this strike, though Yorkshire did get authorisation for strike action 2 years ago. The results of 5 ballots have become known, and the results still to come from 4 other areas, including the very important Nottingham area, the country's second biggest. But the signs there tonight is that it is voting too against striking. The miners' problem is that they're taking action when supplies of coal are at record levels for the time of year. 28-week supplies with spring and summer coming up. And the last time the miners had a spring offensive was in ill-fated 1926. So the Coal Board and the government are taking a long-run view of this dispute. They don't think a national strike vote can be delivered. But disputes like this are unpredictable and there are high risks for both sides. Already there look to be two certain casualties, the pits themselves and relations between miners.
The Attorney General said today the criminal law of the land applies to miners just as much as anyone else. Sir Michael Havers said the police had the power to stop flying pickets on the road and turn them back. If they refused, they'd be committing an offence. There's a big police operation to deal with violence on the picket lines.
Can I just tell you the situation around it?
High up on the 13th floor of Scotland Yard, more than 150 miles from the main coalfields, the nerve centre of the police operation.
Leicestershire, Derbyshire and Staffordshire forces have advised us that probably as from Sunday they may well be coming to us for some aid.
From here, senior officers follow developments 24 hours a day and coordinate the efforts of those involved. All 43 county forces are on standby. Any one could be asked for help at a moment's notice. At a glance, officers here can see just what extra resources are available to them. Coloured arrows show the strength of the backup in any particular county and how quickly they can be sent to any particular pit. Home Office officials and inspectors of constabulary are on hand to deal with any unexpected problems.
Well, as soon as they can, would you let me...
Humberside's Chief Constable, David Hall, has come south to take charge.
Been very, very effective and, if I might say, very efficient. We've been able to satisfy all the requirements and to dispatch them very speedily to the centres they are being requested for.
Already, over 4,000 extra policemen have been called up from here. Thousands more are on standby.
Thank you very much. Bye.
2 Yorkshire miners arrested outside a colliery in Staffordshire were in court today. Thomas Werrett, who's from Doncaster, admitted obstructing the police and was fined £150. His brother admitted using threatening behaviour. His fine, £300.
Last week had endured mass picketing by striking miners from Yorkshire. Voting at the 25 pits began last night after the pickets withdrew from the county.
Over 300 men at Staffordshire's Lee Hall Colliery defied flying pickets this morning and went to work. Some 50 Yorkshire miners stayed on picket duty afterwards and angrily refused to talk about their presence there.
If that's on, mister, turn it off. If they don't turn it off, I'll break it.
Meanwhile, at a meeting of the Midlands Area Council of the Union, local officials found that the Staffordshire men had refused to strike by 7,500 votes to 2,800, 72% voting to work.
Surprised by the results? You recommended them to vote for a strike.
Yes, we were surprised at what has happened, but if we believe in democracy, there we are. We've got to accept the situation.
Your men are voting to go to work. And you're telling them not to cross picket lines.
Well, we don't cross picket lines. That was the view of the council.
So if one picket from anywhere turns up at any pit, they can't go to work even though they've voted to do so?
We do not usually cross picket lines. That's been the solidarity of the union. And apart from that, we are sending up to National a recommendation to reconvene the NEC as soon as possible and reconsider the decision they've made, because the council have said it is creating anarchy within the union.
Broadly, today's results amount to a severe setback for the miners' leadership. The National Executive last week promised official support for any area which followed Yorkshire and Scotland and took strike action over closures and job cuts. But most miners, given the choice, said they'd rather work. And the advice to miners in most cases will be not to cross picket lines even where the vote's been to keep working. The Coal Board's hope is that its action through the courts, which may result in the seizure of all or parts of the Yorkshire NUM's £8 million of assets, will curb the illegal picketing. Hopes of healing the damaging splits which have opened up in a union which prides itself on solidarity are certain to lead to renewed calls for a national strike ballot to settle the matter.
British Rail has told South Wales train crews they'll be sent home without pay if they refuse to move coal across picket lines. Coal deliveries to a power station in Glamorgan have been disrupted since the strike began. In Nottinghamshire, Councillor Frank Taylor of the Police Committee said the police costs were running at £500,000 a day and the government should stand the bill. Nottinghamshire is the first county where the Home Secretary's nominee, Sir Lawrence Byford, is helping to liaise and coordinate police work during the picketing. And the Labour leader, Mr Kinnock, appealed today for peaceful picketing. He said miners' families were as distressed as anyone else by violence. He was asked on a visit to the Midlands if he wasn't worried that the miners' union might tear itself apart.
I'd be very concerned about that. I think that the strengths that exist in the National Union of Mine Workers can prevent that. But if the union is looking for a source of unity, I have to tell you that the kind of enmity and hostility that the actions of the government and the Coal Board have undertaken in the last few days, just the kind of thing that will weld the union together as a solid body of men who won't let anybody try to tell them, dictate to them what they should be doing.
Mr David Jones, the Yorkshire miner who died after clashes on a Nottinghamshire picket line, was due to be tried for soccer hooliganism. The police say Mr Jones was charged 3 weeks ago with having a piece of wood as an offensive weapon when on a trip with his team, Frickley Colliery.
The time now is 7:30.
Britain's second largest coalfield has voted 3-1 against the strike. Nottinghamshire's 30,000 miners have overwhelmingly rejected the call to strike over proposed pit closures, as did North Wales earlier today. This evening, North Derbyshire also voted against strike action, but only narrowly. In Mansfield, Nottinghamshire NUM officials said the big no had been a protest against intimidation by flying pickets from Yorkshire. Area President Ray Chadburn gave the result.
It is 73.5 against strike action and 26.5 in favour. That is the decision.
So, overwhelmingly, Nottinghamshire's miners have opted for moderation, influenced and incensed by the ugly violence this week of the flying pickets. The key question now is, will those pickets return to try and stop the Nottinghamshire men attempting to go back to work?
Well, we can't foresee what's going to happen in the future, but we'll have to wait and see. But when we talk about violence, we've got to remember that the majority of the picketing was peaceful. Now, we would hope that we've all learnt lessons from the last week, and at least if picketing does come back, at least we hope that it will be peaceful. But that's for other people to make those decisions.
Mr Scargill is now under considerable pressure for a national strike ballot, with many miners simply anxious to get back to work.
Well, I've noticed the trend that's taking place in the British coalfield, and what's happening is that there's approximately a 10% swing towards taking action compared with the results last year. And I noticed that that's been conveniently ignored by the media. Two areas, for example, I'm told Derbyshire and Northumberland have voted in favour of action, when last year they voted against action. And if you take all the votes into consideration, including the anticipated votes, say Nottinghamshire, and you also calculate the ones in Yorkshire and those areas which are already participating in strike action, it shows that there is a majority of miners at the present time in support of action.
Are you now prepared to consider a national ballot?
I'm prepared to consider whatever my membership feel appropriate at any particular time. But what I'm not prepared to consider is either ITV, BBC, or the jackals and hyenas of Fleet Street giving me advice. That I won't consider, you can rest assured.
Hundreds of police were tonight moving into 2 army camps in Nottinghamshire and a barracks near Grantham in Lincolnshire, ready to protect Nottinghamshire miners from flying pickets. Nottinghamshire's Chief Constable, Mr Charles McLaughlin, says any coach operators who bring striking pickets into the county will be liable to arrest and prosecution.
Divide between Protestant and Catholic communities. It's now just after 10:10 and time for the news with Jan Leeming.
Thousand policemen move into Nottinghamshire as miners' leaders there say we're going back to work. Yorkshire miners will be sending flying pickets to Nottinghamshire and other counties tomorrow. The area executive made the decision tonight, although it wasn't announced publicly. About 2,000 extra policemen are in Nottinghamshire to strengthen the local force, and they say anyone reporting for work will get through any picket lines. Police confirmed tonight they'd stopped carloads of miners heading north from the Kent coalfield. Earlier today, the miners in Nottinghamshire were told to report for work tomorrow by their local union leaders. Within hours, the special meeting of the Yorkshire Executive was held.
When the meeting broke up after more than 2 hours, the delegates were obviously under strict orders to maintain the secrecy of their deliberations.
No comment.
A small group of Yorkshire miners stood on the pavement waiting to hear how the flying pickets would be instructed to react to the Nottinghamshire decision. A number of miners from Kent had driven to Barnsley to offer their services. Eventually, they managed to persuade the Yorkshire headquarters men to open up, but maintained the silence of all the other departures when they left. Tonight's official silence in public can probably be explained because the delegates wanted to avoid any direct contempt of court. But that wall of silence soon crumbled unofficially. It leaked out that the Yorkshire leaders had decided that their flying pickets would be at pits in Nottinghamshire and Lancashire in the morning. They argue that their strike is official and that they will continue to confront miners who want to work, whatever the action by the courts or the police.
In Nottinghamshire, police sealed off the NUM area headquarters as 270 delegates met to consider the 3-1 vote against strike action. The security operation clearly disconcerted delegates who had to produce credentials before passing through police checkpoints. The meeting voted to return to work tomorrow and to call for an urgent meeting of the NEC to approve a full national ballot.
We're appealing to people not to send pickets in because of the number of policemen that have besieged Nottinghamshire. Britain is an island. Nottinghamshire is an island on its own within an island. It's difficult for any of us to get in and out without credentials. So you can appreciate that all it will do, if pickets come in, will exacerbate the situation.
The Nottinghamshire NUM leaders are clearly seeking to defuse an explosive situation. But if Yorkshire miners do converge on the area tomorrow, and the present massive police operation casts considerable doubt on that, then the bottom line is that Nottinghamshire miners will report for work tomorrow, picket lines or not.
Throughout the day, convoys of police reinforcements arrived at the Nottinghamshire coalfields. They're being billeted indefinitely at 3 army camps in the area. Thousands of policemen from all over the country in one of the biggest operations of its kind ever seen. They arrived in specially chartered coaches, and behind in the convoys, transit vans were loaded with riot control gear, shields and helmets. Their brief is to ensure that miners wanting to return to work tomorrow are able to get through any picket lines. But this saturation police cover will make it extremely difficult for any flying pickets even to reach the Nottinghamshire collieries. There'll be police checkpoints at motorway exits, searches for offensive weapons, and flying pickets will be turned back. Coach drivers bringing in any pickets have been warned they're liable to arrest and prosecution. The police are determined to avoid any repeat of last week's ugly clashes. But the people of Ollerton, scene of some of the worst violence, are still fearful of more trouble.
The scenes in Nottinghamshire tonight are just part of the largest mobilisation of policemen the country's seen during any industrial dispute since the end of the war. Officers in every one of the 43 county forces in England and Wales have been put on standby. From Devon and Cornwall to Cumbria, each chief constable has had to indicate how many support units he could dispatch to the coalfields and how long it would take them to get there. Already, 8,000 police officers have been deployed at various stages of the dispute. Those leaving today were clearly prepared for a long stay. Senior officers accompanied 500 men from the Metropolitan Police, who journeyed north to Nottinghamshire this morning. A similar number were due to leave for the Leicestershire coalfields just a few minutes ago. The coaches were carrying some of the fittest and best trained men in the force. Discreetly hidden away, but travelling with them, riot shields and protective helmets just in case things get out of hand. The convoys travelled up the A1 to one of 3 army barracks which have been specially commissioned to accommodate officers from 16 separate forces. On the ground, decisions will be made by the local chief constable. But the nerve centre of the whole operation is more than 150 miles away on the 13th floor of Scotland Yard.
Leicestershire are certainly in the same position. Derbyshire have got the same result, and it would appear from what I see that most of you are going to be in the same position on Monday morning, and you'll need a lot of help.
Information about the pickets' movements and any possible police response is coordinated here. The changing situation monitored day and night. Phones have also been scrambled for use by inspectors of constabulary and Home Office officials. At a news conference tonight, the man in charge of the operation said there was no question of government pressure being brought to bear on police decisions, but warned,
"We are determined collectively as chief constables to ensure that the rule of law is maintained, and those people on Sunday evening or Monday morning who wish to go to work will be able so to do.
If the Yorkshire pickets do turn out in force tomorrow, hundreds could be turned back miles from the pits. Any coach driver carrying flying pickets who disobeys any police instruction to turn back could face immediate arrest.
Hello, good evening. An unprecedented operation by police stops many of the flying pickets, but the police interpretation of their powers will be questioned in the courts. Tense moments as Yorkshire miners await news of their contempt hearing, but the Coal Board pull back when they learn that 4 times Friday's number of pits are able to work. Also tonight, Edward Heath tells us what he thinks of this miners' strike and takes a critical view of the budget. But first, the miners' strike. 42 of Britain's 174 pits are now working normally, as many miners in areas which voted not to join the strike crossed picket lines. On Friday, only 11 pits were working, but in many areas of the country, the strike stays solid. The police mounted a major operation today to stop flying pickets going to the pits where men had decided to work. Coaches and minibuses taking pickets from the Kent and Yorkshire coalfields were stopped and advised to turn back. But the Kent miners believe the police may have overstepped the law, and they're going to test it in the courts. Police said that the operation, coordinated by the National Reporting Centre at Scotland Yard in London, was to ensure that those miners who wanted to work could do so, and to prevent more violence on the picket lines. But miners' leaders accused the police of intervening in the dispute at the behest of the government. Today's other developments: the National Coal Board has adjourned its contempt case against the Yorkshire miners. The NCB said it had decided not to go ahead with its action because of the area ballots against strike action and because all the miners who'd wanted to work today had managed to do so. But the miners' national president, Arthur Scargill, said the NCB's decision was due directly to the solidarity of the miners and the tremendous support from the trade union movement. And in North Derbyshire, the area executive has called its members out on strike, despite a vote by a narrow majority by the miners there to carry on working. So this afternoon, 123 pits are on strike or closed by pickets, mostly in Yorkshire, the North East, Scotland, South Wales and Kent. 42 are at work and another 11 are partly working. They're mostly in the Midlands, where miners have voted against joining the strike. In Nottinghamshire, which has been the scene of the heaviest picketing so far, all 26 pits are open except for one which is closed for maintenance. All the pits in Leicestershire and South Derbyshire are working. Just one of Warwickshire's 5 pits was closed by pickets. Only in North Derbyshire did the strike bite. There the miners had been split on the strike vote. This afternoon, after their executive had recommended that they come out, only one pit carried on working. Despite the activity of the police and lawyers, pickets were out on the road again early today from Yorkshire, Kent and South Wales in an effort to persuade their less militant colleagues in other parts of the country not to report for work. Jane Corbyn followed a group of flying pickets from the Doncaster area to a Nottinghamshire colliery.
They were burning the midnight oil at the Brodsworth Miners' Welfare as union officials decided where and how to send out flying pickets. By 3 a.m, the first 2 cars were on the road, 8 flying pickets bound for Nottinghamshire and the Bevercoats colliery. First stop, an all-night garage to fill up the tanks, in case they had to backtrack and circle the area for hours to avoid the police cordon. Once on the motorway, they headed south, wondering just how far they'd get with an estimated 3,000 policemen drafted into the area. The pickets passed several patrols along the motorway, but the police were obviously playing a waiting game. One patrol car even pulled up alongside them for a closer look, but allowed them to continue.
They all tied together?
What, in the car, yeah?
No, the 2 cars behind you.
Oh, is it? I don't know.
You don't?
At the back entrance to the pit, a police officer questioned the pickets, who were vague about their destination. They were directed past the pit. Once they'd driven a safe distance from the police, They stopped, temporarily lost. After checking their bearings, they agreed on a peaceful picketing strategy for Bevercoats.
If we go this way, we'll turn round, we'll pull around and we'll try and... Don't forget, lads, if we get there, there's no arguments, we'll just ask them not to cross the road.
They reached the front entrance of the mine without further hindrance and joined the 100 or so pickets assembling there to greet the 6 a.m. shift. The police were drafting in extra men from the 3 camps in the area. The atmosphere was calm at this time, but riot shields were waiting in police vans. Did the pickets from Brodsworth think the Bevercoats miners would listen?
Well, we hope so. We're hoping so. We're hoping they won't cross the picket line, and that's it. Because that's a trade union's duty, not to cross a picket line. That's the thing you learn when you join a union. You do not cross a picket line.
The Yorkshire men were determined to convince the Nottingham colliers that they could, in the future, suffer the same fate as miners in Yorkshire, pit closures and redundancies. The union should therefore be united, not split. But most of the miners arriving for the early shift were not persuaded. They drove straight through. Yorkshire miners are bitter that their more affluent Nottinghamshire brothers have, as they see it, sold out. One Brodsworth picket told me his weekly bonus from the less productive Yorkshire mine is the same as a Bevercoats collier gets for just one day. But the Yorkshire miners did have some success. A few Bevercoats miners turned back to their delight.
What will you be doing now?
Standing with these and going home.
So you're supporting them?
Yep.
He was warmly welcomed onto the picket line. Only one miner ventured through the picket line on foot. And when the colliery buses arrived, tempers flared because the men inside were insulated from the Yorkshire men's taunts.
I wanted to know why these pickets aren't being allowed to approach the men.
As far as I'm concerned...
You don't make your mind up whether a dispute, or we'll make his mind up whether it is a dispute. And I'm telling you, I want to see these pickets being allowed to approach these men.
The police refused the Bevercoats Union Secretary's request to allow Yorkshire pickets to talk to his miners.
You have been warned not to obstruct the highway, okay?
The situation looked ugly, but it seemed the police were not anxious to make arrests and risk violence. The shift began as dawn broke and the pickets began to drift away. What did they feel they'd achieved?
Well, we've proved one thing, we are peaceful. We are decent, ordinary human beings. And all we want is the right to have people to work in the mines. If these lads want to back, if we got one person turn back this morning here, we've got a victory.
30 Bevercoats miners turned back, but not enough to close the mine.
The miners of Nottinghamshire have been the main target of those flying pickets. What effect have the incidents of the past few days had on the Nottinghamshire men? Edward Sturton visited Sherwood Colliery near Mansfield to find out.
1:35 on Saturday, John Liptrot, branch secretary at Sherwood Colliery for 12 years, gets the news that Nottingham's voted not to come out. It only confirmed his view of the national leadership's handling of the dispute.
Well, I've no doubt in my mind that they've played it like a set of schoolboys, and if they had have done what they should have done on 8th of March, then it would probably been a different picture for him, but they certainly played it like rank amateurs. Cheers now. I don't know where we're going to go to from this particular piece of information that I've just received. This weekend they'll have to clarify the situation one way or the other.
An hour later in a local pub, the result is being discussed by men from Sherwood and neighbouring pits over a lunchtime drink. So what do they think the Notts leadership should do now?
Our leadership should do now?
Yeah.
Well, naturally, you've got to, I mean, if it's right what we have here, the old species start coming down, do not cross the picket line.
Despite the fact that most people voted to work.
Yeah. Still got to respect the picket line.
They've been given a mandate and they should take a lead. And they should say to us, right, we've had a ballot, we're going to work. And they should say, we're going to work. And they shouldn't say, OK, we've had a ballot, but you haven't got to cross the picket line, which is what other areas have said, Midland areas have said that. And as far as we're concerned, that stinks.
9:15 Sunday morning, John Liptrot leaves home early, expecting to find Yorkshire pickets at the Notts area meeting called to respond to the ballot result. The police were also anticipating a big contingent from Yorkshire, and the roads around the Notts NUM building were completely sealed off. In the event, the only pickets that did turn up were from Nottinghamshire, bitterly opposed to their leadership's original support for the strike.
And if we don't get what we want, if we can't go to work, then these lot up here, they want outing. They're no good to us at all.
Do you think that there's a danger that this will actually split the union apart altogether?
Yes. We hope it does. Let Yorkshire look after Yorkshire, we'll look after Notts.
Just after 1, the meeting breaks up, and the Notts pickets got the decision they wanted. John Liptrot was now clear about what to do.
People will be going to work tomorrow, yes.
And will you be there to make sure that everything goes smoothly?
I will be at Sherwood Colliery in the morning to see that the membership have the choice of what they've democratically decided they would do, yes.
That afternoon at a local miners' welfare, the debate is still bitter.
Do you think Mr. Scargill is a leader when he's watching miner fight miner? He's a bloody washout as a leader.
He's not caused it.
He's what?
We've caused it down here.
All we've done is split the union.
That's all Mr. McGregor
That's
did
all
in
we've done,
America.
split the union. We're fighting against each other instead of fighting the coal board.
5:30 this morning, John Liptrot is at the pit helping the police to identify Sherwood miners on their way into work. A small group of pickets from Yorkshire and South Wales were kept well back from the main entrance. Are you pleased with the way things have gone this morning?
Not pleased at all, no. I'm not pleased at all. The situation, civil war, as I've said before, doesn't taste very nice. And it's just as bitter this morning as it has been all week.
A few men did stay out, but the coal board said most went in, and Sherwood is now working normally. Edward Sturton, ITN, Mansfield.
More than 2,000 policemen from 16 forces have been drafted into the Nottinghamshire area. But as we said, the police strategy is being coordinated centrally from New Scotland Yard in London. And part of the plan has been to stop miners going to picket those pits which are still open. Yorkshire miners were stopped on the M62 on their way to Lancashire, and Kent miners were told to turn back as they approached the Dartford Tunnel under the Thames. Police said they were acting to prevent any breaches of the peace. But already some lawyers have said the police are abusing their power. Now, Kent miners are to take the police to court. Alistair Stewart unravels the legal background.
This has been one of the largest and most tightly coordinated police operations ever. It has also seen a wider than normal interpretation of police powers in the control of mass pickets. It's the Employment Act that limits picketing in industrial disputes. As the Home Secretary reminded the House of Commons on Thursday, the law permits picketing for the purpose of peacefully communicating and persuading, but any attempt to obstruct or intimidate those who wish to go to work is a breach of the criminal law. When the picketing is carried out by workers from another pit, however, there are grounds for a civil action, such as that brought by the National Coal Board against the Yorkshire miners. But that is not a matter for the police or the criminal law. It's only when obstruction, intimidation, violence or any other breach of the peace occurs that the police can move in to end it. Criminal charges could then be brought against the alleged perpetrators. But at the Dartford Tunnel last night, several carloads of miners from the Kent coalfield were stopped by police, and according to the miners were warned they might be heading towards a situation in which a breach of the peace might occur. On that basis alone, they say, they were strongly advised to go no further. At that stage, they hadn't committed an offence, but according to the Home Office, the police were within their general powers of responsibility for keeping the peace to do what they did. Had the miners refused the advice, according again to the Home Office, they could have been arrested under the 1964 Police Act for obstructing a police officer in the course of his duty. And that was also the view taken by the Home Secretary when he told the House of Commons on Thursday the police have the power to take preventative action by stopping vehicles and people. This is the main office at Scotland Yard of the National Reporting Centre, a body established by the Chief Constables and the Home Office to coordinate national police operations. The current cost of about £500,000 a day will be split between the Home Office and the county police committees. Humberside's Chief Constable David Hall is in charge. I asked him about police powers.
I would expect the supervisory officers in Nottingham or Warwickshire and such like to remind the officers before duty of their various powers. There is a right in this country, and there has been for many, many years, that a person can endeavour to peacefully persuade a person to work or to refrain from working. What happened last week, and has happened in the past on occasions, is people have tried to use muscle to effect that end. they've had these mass pickets, they've used physical violence. Now that's quite unlawful. It is not unlawful to say to a person, if he's entering a mine, we are on strike and we don't want you to go in. And if that person declines, that should be the end of the matter.
Should those powers extend so that a group of miners who may be travelling from Kent to Nottinghamshire, a distance of some 200 miles, should be stopped and cautioned?
I think it's quite justifiable for an officer to say, if you are going to a certain location, I think the presence there will incense the situation, and it's advisable for you not to go. That's what policemanship is all about. Policemanship is about trying to advise people and getting them to comply without having to resort to a legal process. Now, whether or not the circumstances, and I don't know the details of the Kent incident, whether the circumstances there were sufficient for an arrest to be made is problematical. I don't know. But I think it's good policemanship to advise people. All we're intent on doing is to make sure that violence doesn't occur. And surely anything the police services does in that respect is to be congratulated upon, is it not?
But Walter Merricks of the New Law Journal believes the interpretation of those powers has been too wide.
The police certainly have preventive powers to do things near the scene of a breach of the peace. If you have a large picket going on with a possibility of a breach of the peace or a breach of the peace actually in progress, then there's no doubt the police have the power to stop additional people joining that scene. What I don't think they have, and they've certainly never claimed to have up until now, is the power to stop people many hundreds of miles away from proceeding lawfully across the country towards that scene. As I say, many hundreds of miles away, and I don't think ever the police have claimed that right before, or it's been said by the government or any senior legal official that they would have that right in law.
When these events finally come to an end, will there be a body of opinion within the legal profession that will express reservations about the way the police have handled it all?
If there's no challenge in the courts and no opportunity for the courts to rule on the stopping of people miles away from the scene of a disturbance, if there's no opportunity for the courts to rule on that, I think lawyers will be worried, because it's a new departure, it's never been done before, and it's never been said that it was legal before. And I think that if that goes unchallenged, then it will be a marker and a milestone for the future on which no doubt those people who want to see that happen more often can build.
Within the last hour, with advice from the NCCL, Kent miners have said they will take action against the police over the Dartford incident.
The question is, on what basis can the police impose that restriction on people's right to move freely in the country? This is something that we generally cherish, a right to move freely. Now, they say that they need to do it in order to prevent a breach of the peace. So the question is, how imminent is a breach of the peace? How near are we to a breach of the peace situation? Well, when you're on the borders of Kent and the only threat to a breach of the peace is some 100 or more miles away, then is there a right for the police to intervene in this way in people's basic liberties? We think that there isn't, and that they've gone well outside their powers.
There were scuffles between police and pickets outside the headquarters of the Yorkshire offices of the Mine Workers Union in Barnsley this afternoon, shortly after miners there had heard that the National Coal Board had adjourned its court action against the Yorkshire area of the union. More than 100 police had been sent to the Yorkshire NUM headquarters. There were about 1,000 miners there to protect it from any bailiffs who might materialise. Trouble flared when some men chased a BBC camera crew. As the police went to their help, fights broke out. The Yorkshire president, Jack Taylor, had to appeal for calm. Afterwards, he spoke to Michael Green.
Well, my view is that we had a tremendous demonstration today in Yorkshire, absolute solidarity from our members, and I think that the board today have rethought their position. I mean, if they would only do that about pit closures, we could be getting this industry back to work, and we could be getting somewhere.
You see it as them backing off?
Well, I mean, that's how I see it. I weren't in court, and that's how our members in Yorkshire see it. I mean, I don't want to sort of arrogantly push the point, but the point is, you know, that everybody's been interested over the last week about picketing and things like that, but the real issue has been forgotten. The real issue is about pit closures and jobs.
The council also said they hoped it would be possible for a position to be reached whereby miners could work without substantial police protection. Is there a prospect of a deal which would stop your flying pickets?
Oh, I tell you, we'll stop our flying pickets straight away as soon as that,
you know, people in other areas start to look to the responsibilities. And there's no reason at all why miners can't talk to other miners, a thing that's been established over a large number of years. You know, we're not just fighting for Yorkshire pits, we're fighting for the whole of the industry. And there'd be no need for picketing at all if people would, in other areas, would support each other. And today, we might not be talking about the board rethinking the policies on injunctions. We might be talking about the board rethinking the policies on pit closures.
Mr. Taylor, aren't you opening yourself to the accusation that you're against democracy, against the ballot box, and in favour of mob rule?
No, I'm not. There's nobody more democratic than I am, and there's nobody more law and order. I don't ever remember breaking the law in the whole of my life, and I don't intend to break the law, but I do intend to fight for my members' jobs. And if anybody can tell me a better way of keeping Corton Wood and Bultcliffe, the two pits that we are fighting for, open, then I'm quite willing to sit and listen.
So where does this dispute go from here? The Coal Board seem determined to sit tight. Their main card is the renewal of proceedings for contempt against the Yorkshire miners if they manage to resume mass picketing. But even if mass picketing beats the police blockades, Mr. McGregor may calculate he doesn't need to go back to law, but that he can spend the next 6 months, for that's how long he thinks stocks can last, watching the NUM weaken itself and closing pits for him. He may calculate that even an all-out strike backed by a national ballot would have the same effect. What of Mr. Scargill's position? He can let things go on as they are, in which case his union stays split and acts split. He can encourage greater efforts to beat the police blockades, perhaps even join the challenge to its legality. But that risks the reopening of proceedings for contempt and huge confiscatory fines. Or he can change his mind and go for a national ballot, which the figures already suggest he could lose. But even if he wins, the risk that he runs is that the miners could not stay solid for a strike of many months. He needs a formula to reunite his union, put muscle into the fight, stay solvent, and make Ian McGregor's closure programme more difficult. It could be a tall order. Government. Do you believe there are dangers for this government in confrontation with the miners?
No government wants to have a confrontation with the miners or with trade unions. I think the situation here is quite clear, that Mr. Scargill does want to carry out certain actions, then he ought to take a vote of the miners overall and not try to get around it by dealing with it section by section. I'm sure that is really the democratic action, and I think it's probably what the great majority of miners themselves want. It may be that they would vote for the action. I hope they wouldn't, because I don't think it's justified, and I don't think that in these circumstances they could win. Stocks of coal are so very large that industry could carry on for a long time, and we could carry on such exports as we have for a long period. And so I would hope that they would come to the conclusion that they should carry on.
Are you saying that Mrs. Thatcher can't suffer from the miners in the way that your government did?
This is completely different from 1974. And after all, I put the question to the electorate. But the electorate, although they gave us more votes, didn't give us more seats in the House of Commons. That was what happened.
Can the miners win this dispute?
I don't think they can, and I think many of them realize that. I have every sympathy with them about the closure of pits, and I'm sure it's incumbent on the National Coal Board. They must carry out the fullest possible discussions with miners' leaders before they come to conclusions about closing pits. And of course it would be much easier if we had full employment again, to show that miners could move into other jobs. Alternatively, we've got to show them that they can be retrained, or that they can be moved into pits which are expanding because they are new, they've got modern equipment, and their cost of production is much lower. All of that must be done in order to remove the very genuine anxieties which miners and their families have.
Has Mr. McGregor then been trying to go too fast?
Well, I have no inside information. I only read what is reported about it, and they complain about a lack of consultation. There must never be grounds for that complaint.
War News with Peter Sissons.
Mr. Stewart.
The National Union of Mine Workers has failed in a legal move to stop the police from setting up roadblocks and preventing them travelling outside their area. 2 Kent miners who'd been stopped at the Dartford Tunnel sought an injunction in the High Court to prevent it happening again, but the judge turned it down. Afterwards, the miners said they'd go on sending pickets outside their area, and the police said they'd go on stopping them.
We intend to continue to send pickets into other coalfields. We have pickets in other coalfields, and we intend to continue on that action. And we are also in the process of bringing pickets into the London area as well.
My interpretation of the decision is that it will not make the slightest difference to the attitude of the Chief Constable, now or in the future, with regard to the upholding of the criminal law in Kent. The Chief Constable has been and is only concerned to carry out his duty to uphold the rule of law.
The Leicestershire miners have voted overwhelmingly against going on strike, and the Coal Board says that this evening 38 of its 175 pits are fully operational. That's slightly fewer than this time yesterday. At Thoresby Colliery in Nottinghamshire, the morning shift, shielded from pickets by over 100 police, went into work. But most of this afternoon's shift is reported to have turned back. 125 policemen, drafted into the area from Durham, have been billeted in a disused maternity home near Chesterfield. They said picketing had been generally peaceful, but Mine Workers Union leader Arthur Scargill had some harsh words about the police.
I'm saying that the police presence in North and South Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire at the present time is unwarranted and unprecedented, and it's almost tantamount to a paramilitary state. It's absolutely disgraceful when people have got to prove who they are in order to move around either that or other counties.
Not at all. There's nothing paramilitary about our operation. We are just doing our normal job. The chief constables of this country are adamant that the rule of law will be upheld. People will be allowed to peacefully persuade, and the word peacefully is the essential word.
Nearly 80% of collieries are hit by industrial action, and only 37, one fewer than yesterday, are working normally, with 126 halted completely. There were a few more overnight scuffles, but no trouble on the scale of last week. The Midlands NUM have been meeting in Stafford to consider the effects of picketing in Staffordshire and Warwickshire. Staffordshire has shown one of the biggest falls in miners reporting to work following picketing by South Wales and Yorkshire miners. Overnight picketing concentrated on the Lee Hall and neighbouring Littleton pits. Patrick Burns reports.
Over 200 pickets, more than half of them from South Wales, gathered outside the Lee Hall colliery in Staffordshire. Miners in this coalfield last week voted overwhelmingly against going on strike. It had all begun without violence, although miners arriving earliest for work were given a rowdy reception by the pickets, most of whom were hemmed in from the entrance road by a strong contingent of police who had more men in reserve waiting nearby. A small minority of the miners were persuaded to turn back, again without serious incident. The trouble when it came was sudden, heralded by the arrival en masse of the bulk of those miners who intended to work. By now the police had called in their reinforcements, some on horseback. They say one of their men was slightly injured during the scuffling amid the dense crowd. A total of 8 pickets were arrested here and at the neighbouring colliery of Littleton.
The Coal Board say all 25 pits in Nottinghamshire are producing coal, although this morning 2/3 of the miners at the Blidworth colliery refused to cross picket lines. Some 2,000 police from all over the country have been called into the county to help control the pickets. Looking after and deploying the force is an expensive and complicated operation, as Grant Mansfield reports.
There are reported to be upwards of 2,000 extra policemen in Nottinghamshire at the moment. The cost of the operation is running at £350,000 a day. The officers are being billeted at a number of places across the East Midlands, although those at a council building in North Derbyshire have been told to leave because the local authority says it doesn't want to be seen to be taking sides in the mining dispute. In Nottinghamshire, meanwhile, the hub of the operation, several hundred officers are being billeted at a police training school. Morale here is high, but there are problems, the biggest of which undoubtedly is fatigue. The police are on 24-hour standby, and some of them are working shifts of up to 20 hours at a stretch. At the end of it, there's no guarantee of a proper bed either. At least half of them are having to sleep on mattresses on the floor.
We're having to work them long hours. Whilst they're out, they do get an opportunity to take an hour's and sit down here and there. So the hours are long, and a lot is expected of them, but so far everybody's quite happy and morale is high.
The officers, all from Bedfordshire, arrived on Sunday night in their specially designed transit vans equipped with riot shields. They've been given no official idea of when they're likely to return, but there are already rumours it may be as early as this weekend as the police operation begins to scale down. Whether those rumours are true remains to be seen. What's certain, though, is that the police intend to maintain a substantial presence in the area until the threat of mass picketing subsides.
Conditions at Scotland's biggest prison, Barlinnie in Glasgow, have been described as...
Whitworth and his family. Even food has to be rationed. Homework finished, 11-year-old Karen can have breakfast this morning, but Stan and wife Liz will make do with tea until the family's main meal of the day when Karen comes home from school. Even Patch the mongrel takes his share of cutbacks and is fed only every other day. Liz has a part-time job as a barmaid. Her £20 a week plus £6.50 family allowance is the family's only income.
Everybody's had to cut back. There's no money coming into house. You've got to live on more or less fresh air. It's hitting everybody very hard.
You've talked about the hardships. How long do you think the miners here will be able to last out on strike?
Miners in South Yorkshire have a great resolve. They'll stick it out as long as need be, same as I will.
Even with no money?
Even with no money. We're determined to win this one.
At the Cortonwood Miners Welfare Centre, the colliery choir is in good voice. Singing doesn't cost money. The rest of the miners have had to change their habits. Before the strike, they'd have been in the bar downstairs. Now there's no money for beer.
Well, there's no social life through it. None whatsoever. And this is the third week off, and I haven't had a penny yet.
How long do you think that people like yourselves can hold out?
Until end. We'll hold out as long as we've got to. We're not going to give in.
Stan Whitworth spends most of his time at the strike centre next door, helping union officials organise pickets and plan the overnight trips to Nottinghamshire. The coal board say Cortonwood is uneconomic. The strikers argue there's 5 years' good life left in the pit. Stan Whitworth was moved here when a neighbouring colliery was closed down. He says if the union lose this one, there'll be nowhere left to go. Paul Davis, News at 1 in Yorkshire.
The pit on the edge of the Rhondda Valley has been idle since the beginning of the coal strike. But here and in other pits like it throughout South Wales, miners have volunteered to come in and work long shifts loading up coal for special deliveries to the needy. Over the last 4 days, more than 150 tonnes of coal have been taken out of this coal yard alone, and 800 deliveries have been made to old age pensioners. With the weather still verging on freezing and their stocks of coal almost exhausted, such cases are receiving particular attention.
Yeah, there's cold weather and I can't stand the cold very much.
And who gets what is decided by a miners' union official who meets every day with the coal board.
The miners are the most compassionate men in the world. Their fight is not against the old age pensioners, the sick, the hospitals or the schools. Their fight is against the coal board and this vicious Tory government. And we ensure every time we go on a strike, which is not very often, that we send supplies of household to the hospitals, the schools, the disabled, the injured, the sick, the lot, old age pensioners' homes. We do that every time.
More than 100 schools in the area are threatened with closure, their central heating boilers starved of coal. But deliveries are now getting through, and as a mark of gratitude, the Education Authority are giving miners' children free school meals.
Tell Arthur Scargill we want a ballot.
Although the men have already voted not to strike and most of their pits have been operating. The Nottinghamshire Executive is expected to issue an official instruction tomorrow. The Midlands Area Council of the Miners' Union, which covers Warwickshire and Staffordshire, have already today given the order not to cross the picket lines. And these orders, if obeyed, could reduce the number of pits working normally to about 10 out of a total of 175. The coal board say that so far today, 34 pits have been working normally. That's 4 less than yesterday. At 17 pits, some men are working, but no coal is being produced, and 123 are completely shut down. Ken Rees reports from that important meeting of the Nottinghamshire miners' leaders.
Throughout the day, there was evidence of increased picketing by Yorkshire miners who claimed some success. Now, after a difficult emergency meeting, the Nottinghamshire Area Executive are strongly advising their men not to cross picket lines. Despite their anti-strike vote, it's clear that many Nottinghamshire miners would obey such an instruction. Though equally, many would be furious at what they saw as their executive caving in to pressure from the Yorkshire area. Such a move would lead to a significant number, if not all, the county's pits closing down from tomorrow. And that, of course, would be a major blow to the NCB in their efforts to keep pits open. So how will the Nottinghamshire miners react to this apparent about-face by their executive? Many men still underground don't yet know of the decision, and their action as they face the picket lines tomorrow will be crucial in the progress of this confrontation between the National Coal Board and the Miners' Union.
Reason why the strike was called in the first place. Hardly any news reports have explained this. Earlier this month, the miners were told their pit would close in 5 weeks. Last April, they were told it wouldn't close for 5 years, and the Coal Board continued to invest heavily in it.
In the last 12 months, there's been a methane utilisation plant built, which is a huge generator. It's a massive engine that works on either diesel or gas. We do extract methane, and the idea is they extract it, they burn it in that to generate electricity. As obviously a cost-saving exercise. I don't know what it costs, but I could hazard a guess at perhaps £1 million in total because of the building, etc., that it's housed in. Further to that, in October, just before Christmas I'm talking about, there were a £40,000 refurbishing programme for the Pithead Baths.
They've just closed the colliery on 2 mile away from here, sent men working to Cottonwood, this pit that's closing, at 50-year-old, guaranteed them jobs while they're 55. Some of them's only been here for a week, and they've been told with 6 weeks' notice. And they were saying to give a guarantee of 5 years' work to last them to the 55, when they can accept voluntary redundancy.
The economics of closing Cottonwood don't make sense to the miners. Now the investment programme is complete, they believe the pit will lose much less money than in the past. And they challenge the Coal Board's claim that there's no market for the coal.
We mine the Silkstone seam, which is one of the most valuable and high-quality coals in this country. The board said that. And the argument, I know I've heard it said, the director said that he can't sell our coal, is no markets. And yet at the same time, in the Barnsley area and in the Doncaster area, there are now developments going on in the Silkstone seam.
The biggest grievance is that Cottonwood was the first pit ever to be closed before the seams were exhausted. And the Coal Board overturned a long-established procedure which gives at least 6 months' notice of closure.
Well, one thing that it would have done, if they'd have used the proper procedures, it would have meant that we as a branch could have had the opportunity to have negotiated with management at local and at area level the best deal for our men, in that we would be able to put square pegs in square holes, round pegs in round holes. Men will be transferred to the best that you could do it. You would have a time factor in which you could do that. But when you're talking about 5 weeks and an instant cut-off, how do you manage to negotiate such things? It's sheer impossible. It's just the big take it or leave it, and that's it. And that, I fear, is what would happen.
To the Yorkshire miners, what happened at Cottonwood sets a very dangerous precedent for the whole industry.
We want the opportunity to go and put our case.
After having seen all the amount of work that's been done at Cottonwood and the investment that's gone into it, I know for a fact surely there are some pits in Notts who are talking in terms of only 5 years left, or maybe a little bit more. And if they can do it to us, I don't see why they can't do it to them.
They think they're in a safe area, and nobody's safe. As if we took north, they voted to bug, and the buggers got back. A couple of days later, it's shut. They were supposed to be moderates. We're working, we're all right. Writing's up well, but they can't see it.
You might not know it from watching the news, but picket line violence has been the exception, not the rule. Last week, small groups of miners from Yorkshire peacefully persuaded miners at dozens of collieries outside the county not to work. But this week, they were not even allowed to do that.
They went down armed with some of these, and these are some statements that I had made, put in our case. And they were told by the police that they must not go anywhere near them. They were kept away, and they must not hand any of these over. If they did, they would be lifted. If they spoke, they would be lifted. Of course, it didn't stop them speaking, but they were told that they must not in any way try to get one of these across to one of the Silver Hill men. Now, that to me is an infringement on my rights as a trade unionist, legally picketing, peacefully picketing, to impart my message.
Miners' leaders in the Midlands say police tactics have prompted a dramatic change in mood at the coalfields, and they've instructed miners not to cross picket lines. The Lancashire Executive next move. The number of flying pickets is increasing and fewer men have been reporting for work. Tonight, 128 pits are closed. That's about 80% of Britain's mines at a standstill. And as Martin Adeney reports, the situation may get worse tomorrow.
Today's seen two important developments. There's been a continued steady decline in the number of pits working, but the Durham area, one of those on strike, has decided to call for an emergency executive meeting. This means a majority of the national executive now back a national ballot. But on the ground, it's the pickets who are winning. There are 4 fewer pits open this evening than last night. That in turn is 4 less than the night before. And significantly, the Midlands area, which covers Staffordshire and Warwickshire, decided today to instruct its members not to cross picket lines in spite of their ballot last week. Only 2 of the area's 11 pits are working normally. Area General Secretary Jim Colgan blamed the change of mood on a backlash to the heavy police presence. He said, "The police have done the job that our national executive had failed to do, of getting all miners united." In Nottinghamshire, where most of the pits that are still working are, the union executive upheld the right of their members either to refuse to cross picket lines or to go to work. But in North Wales, the small coalfield is almost closed in spite of a ballot to work, to the despair of the area's General Secretary.
What we said, this is a national issue, and there should be a national campaign with the President leading it from the front, not hiding behind Yorkshire. And we think that the national officials must rescue the situation before it slides. I will say this categorically, as far as North Wales is concerned. If there's no future for the ballot box in the NUM, there's no future for any of us.
Well, the decision of Durham to call officially for a national ballot does mean there's now a majority of the executive in favour. There are 24 members, and 13 of their areas have called for a ballot. 10 are opposed, while the position of the coke workers is in some doubt. The moderate areas want to recall the national executive to stop the drift into total shutdown. And as Felicity Goody reports, that's now apparent even in areas like Lancashire, which have balloted to work.
Yorkshire pickets still guard this pit, but today it was Lancashire miners who turned away Lancashire men. At Parkside, half the men wanted to work, half wanted a strike. But no one likes crossing picket lines, and they're all losing a lot of money. To resolve the confusion, local officials closed the pit and suggest they vote again, despite last week's ballot. But few think that will help.
Bring it to a national ballot, and then the lads know what they're doing, either one way or the other. That's the point, and get on with the job.
So the persistence of the Yorkshire pickets appears at last to be having some effect. At the beginning of this week, roughly half of Lancashire's 7,000 miners crossed their lines and went to work. But over the past few days, the numbers have dwindled steadily. Until today, only Agecroft is still working normally. Overall, last week's vote in Lancashire was close, only 6-4 against. Peaceful pickets have helped tempers cool, and now Parkside's dilemma is spreading throughout the Lancashire field.
At Lee Hall Colliery in Staffordshire early today, more than 200 pickets, half of them from South Wales, found almost as many policemen outside the gates, some of them on horseback. All went peacefully until the bulk of the morning shift workers walked through the gates. Then the rival ranks of policemen and pickets clashed, and in the struggle there were 8 arrests. At Blidworth Colliery in Nottinghamshire, relations between the flying pickets from Yorkshire and the policemen facing them were more cordial. The pickets had cause for good humour. A substantial number of the Nottinghamshire miners there decided not, after all, to report for work. Meanwhile, the Staffordshire Area Council of the NUM met to review the tense and confused situation. They'd earlier voted against a strike, but today they made a concession to the pickets.
Well, to calm the situation, what we've decided on, same as what we've done last Friday, is to advise our people that they should not cross picket lines if they are present pickets from other areas. We are asking other areas to reduce the number of pickets in our area. We think that 6 is sufficient, and we're asking our branch committee men at all our points at pits, area workshops, transport, is to have the committee men with these pickets advising our people not to cross the picket lines.
And 123 pits were not working at all, from Scotland in the north to Kent in the southeast.
The Nottinghamshire Union officials met for 5 hours today to answer calls from union headquarters to tell their men not to cross picket lines. There'll be an official statement tomorrow.
There have been meetings every day this week at the Nottinghamshire Union headquarters in Mansfield. Undoubtedly, the item foremost on each agenda has been the avoidance of a return of the kind of scenes last week when thousands of pickets flooded the county and one man died following violence between pickets and miners who wanted to work. Today's meeting lasted 4 hours, but it was another 4 hours before any hope of clear-cut instructions for miners were dashed when the union once again reaffirmed its view that a picket line was a matter for a man and his conscience. The branch's 2 union leaders left without comment. Henry Richardson, the General Secretary, and Ray Chadburn, President, had been instructed by the executive not to talk to newsmen. But one official at the headquarters did give his view.
That our members have voted to work, and our members have the right to work, and our members are going to work. The ones that don't want to go to work and recognise a picket line, fair enough. And I'm calling on Arthur Scargill and the National Executive to have a national ballot. He's prevaricating, he's doing everything he possibly can to avoid a national ballot, and he's responsible for all the problems that's going on.
Nevertheless, at Blidworth Colliery today came the first signs of cracks in the Nottingham miners' solidarity. Pickets turned away peacefully 2/3 of the day shift, and those who went in soon realised they would not be able to continue. Tonight, some miners arriving at the pit for the night shift were turned away by pickets from the same colliery. The Nottinghamshire NUM executive member for the area, including Blidworth, said tonight he was confident he would have the pit closed by tomorrow. Colin Baker, News at 10, Nottingham.
Waiting for the fallout between growing demands for a strike ballot and renewed efforts to picket out the remaining working pits. The NCB believes no customers are short of coal, and with the weather getting warmer, demand is dropping. But the left's hopes of achieving a national stoppage appeared today to be gaining ground. In Scotland, for a gathering of mining engineers, the Coal Board chairman, Mr. Ian McGregor, confessed he wasn't happy with the number of pits left open.
No, I would like to see more, because I know that a very much larger number of people would like to go to work.
So, the police operation is obviously on a very extensive scale now.
Well, that's, I think, unfortunate, because I'm sure that we have a lot of law-abiding employees.
In Yorkshire, Mr. Scargill was claiming 4 in 5 miners was now involved in the dispute.
80% of our membership are involved, and 80% of the pits are now on strike. The responsibility for that action belongs to Mr. McGregor and the National Coal Board. What flows from here, I can't predict. All I can say is that the responsibility rests with the board, and the responsibility for returning to normal rests with the board. What they should do is to stop their bullying tactics, stop the use of massive police reinforcements in the Nottinghamshire, Midlands and Derbyshire areas, and get back to a sensible state of affairs in this industry.
The Wales TUC decided that if the miners lose, other jobs in supplying and dependent industries will go too. So if the miners call for help, they're encouraging other workers to swell the picket lines.
Indeed, we're specifically recommending that other trade unionists in Wales directly assist the NUM by joining NUM picket lines, and indeed we're also recommending that other trade unionists in Wales should consider what action they can take to assist the National Union of Mine Workers in bringing a speedy resolution and a successful resolution to this particular dispute.
Right-wingers on the NUM executive are increasingly frustrated that Mr. Scargill hasn't called an emergency meeting of the executive. They say most areas want one, and that on their head count a vote for a national strike ballot would be carried by 14 to 10. But the news from Sheffield tonight was that a High Court hearing on a dispute over the union's pension fund has to be heard next week, and that'll tie up 10 executive members required as witnesses. Mr. Scargill might deem it impractical, because of this, to call a special executive, even if he felt the situation required one.
The Kent miners have dropped their legal action against the police. Yesterday, the union failed to get an injunction to prevent the Kent police stopping miners travelling outside the county borders. In South Wales, striking miners have gone back to work to supply hospitals, schools and the needy.
The Nantgarrow pit near the Rhondda Valley has been idle since the beginning of the coal strike. But miners have been coming here and to other pits throughout South Wales, volunteering to work long shifts loading up coal for special deliveries to the needy. Most of the coal from this yard has gone to old-age pensioners. With the weather still cold and their own supplies exhausted, they've been given special priority by the miners.
Out of 175 pits were working normally this morning, and some work was underway at 14 more.
The Lancashire miners' leader, Sid Vincent, left the area conference a short time ago.
I fully believe that the only way we can stop McGregor and company and the government's involved, from closing pits is to take strike action. Now, we've had a vote in this area, and what it did, that ballot vote, it split us right down the middle. You had one big colliery, which voted overwhelmingly in favour. We had our biggest colliery, which was split down the middle, just a few votes in favour of not stopping. And then we had two more fairly large branches. They were split down the middle. Now, that's the position in this area. And in order to maintain unity, we're trying to get the lads together next week, and we're again calling for a national ballot. We're telling the Yorkshire pickets to withdraw immediately. We can picket our own pits without the Yorkshire people being here once we make that decision to stop.
The local union executive man had sworn to close Blidworth today. This morning it looked as if he'd succeed. Over 200 pickets turned out, many from the colliery. Their colleagues on day shift went into the canteen for breakfast. Having discussed the picket line, they then walked out, leaving only a handful to work. So what was it that changed their mind?
Conscience. Been on his mind all week. You know, we've been working, but we haven't really wanted to work.
Many of the other lads coming out?
I think most of them have come out this morning, not many gone in.
And what's your feeling about it all?
I think we've really got to support the lads with shutting the pits in Yorkshire. Because it's going to happen down here eventually. We all know it's going to happen. And we've got to do it sometime, might as well do it now.
At nearby Mansfield, miners did cross picket lines. Their union had told them if they wanted to work, then they should, though it also told them they could picket if they wanted to, causing some confusion.
We've all been firmly against coming out on strike, and I think our union should back us. We've voted not to come on strike, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm coming to work, provided the police let us through.
At Benting, the morning shift were lectured by pickets from Yorkshire, frustrated by the apparent lack of concern about pit closures among local miners.
We're here fighting for our jobs, and it's going to be your jobs in the next 12 months. Come and fight. Are you men are nice? Your children's going to be without work in a few years' time. Their children's going to be without work. What are we going to do about it?
Despite the picketing, the Coal Board claim that all 25 of Nottinghamshire's pits are still producing some coal. Colin Baker, News at 1, Nottingham.
The leaders of 7,000 open cast workers are meeting to decide what action to take in support of the miners' strike. Kent miners' leaders have urged them to stop the movement of coal. Yesterday, the Wales TUC asked other trades unionists to join the picket lines, but so far the TUC in London hasn't been asked to help. With me is the TUC chairman, Ray Buckden, who in his other hat is also leader of the Train Drivers Union. Wearing that hat first, Mr. Buckden, if asked, will the train drivers stop the coal moving around the country?
The train drivers have already pledged full support to the Mine Workers Union. As a matter of fact, my members throughout the country have been instructed by their executive committee not to pass picket lines. They aren't doing. And as far as we're concerned, where there is an official picket, then the men stop. Some men have indeed been sent home by the British Railways Board, but thank goodness they haven't exploded that too far at the present time.
Has Mr. Scargill or the leaders of any of the individual NUM branches, NUM areas, been in touch with you?
Yes, we've been in touch all the time ever since indeed before the strike started. My local officials are in constant touch with them, and they're working in great... in fact, yesterday afternoon, I was talking to some of the leaders about the Askham coal-light plant, where they put a picket on there, so our people said we're not going in. We believe this is good trade union policy, and indeed it is the constitutional policy of my own trade union.
What about the TUC generally? Mr. Scargill apparently hasn't asked the TUC
for
blanket support.
As we all appreciate, you know, and I think everybody does in the country, that the autonomy is left with each individual trade union. During disputes of this kind, if a trade union comes to the TUC for help, then they make an approach. Or indeed, if any other unions who feel that they're affected to such an extent they should report it to the TUC, they do. And up to me talking to Lionel Murray last, then there's been no approach, so of course we're not intervening as a TUC. But of course everybody are trade unionists, and I'm hoping that everybody will realise the seriousness of this position to the whole trade union movement, where we can see there by your pictures the industrial relations being fought out between police and men on streets. Surely, I saw the word in your opening remarks about conciliation instead of confrontation in Europe. Why can't we have conciliation now?
Well, Mr. Scargill says there hasn't been much of a problem on the picket lines. There's very isolated cases.
Problem of what type?
violence on the picket line.
No, I aren't saying there's violence, but isn't that a confrontation when you see rows of police, thousands and thousands of policemen there on our streets? Don't you think it would be better, rather than abandon the responsibilities, if the government brought the sides together to talk about it round a room instead of shouting around on the streets? I think it would be far better, and I'm sure the miners would appreciate this, because I do remember Mr. Scargill's been asking for more talks about this very serious position in the coal fields. It can be any union next, you see. This is why I believe it is a matter for the whole trade union movement now, and that's why I'm sure that everybody's hoping this is brought to an end very quickly. If not, I'm sure the whole trade union movement must realise the serious concern that there is in industrial relations in this country at the present time, and this matter of conflict as we see in it.
Ray Buckland, thank you very much indeed.
One after the 9 o'clock news with Sue Lawley.
Join the strike, despite the fact that they voted by almost 6-4 against a strike. Local union representatives today decided to call them out from Monday, but also to press for a national ballot. The Coal Board described the strike call as an abdication of democracy. In Nottinghamshire, there were more heavy picketings today, but the Coal Board said that across the country, 3 more pits than yesterday were at work.
The Lancashire delegates faced a dilemma, only 1 pit working and an increasing reluctance to cross picket lines. They feared their men would soon start to turn on each other, so despite last week's vote rejecting a strike, they called everyone out for a week from Monday.
We've reached a situation where we as an area had to do something to bring our members together.
But you're saying that you think your men voted the wrong way, and now you, their delegates, are going to take the decision back out of their hands.
I never said our men voted the wrong way. When you have a democratic ballot, it's up to the individual member. What we've done this morning, we hope to get a national ballot, and then that will regularise the position right across the country.
But at the 1 pit left working, confusion still reigns. A mass meeting voted to continue production, but the pickets were promised the pit would be closed. What will happen on Monday, no one seems certain. And if there's no national ballot, what happens then? No one tonight seemed able to say.
In Nottinghamshire, the working miner still braves the pickets' abuse. Each shift discusses the uncomfortable pressure. Some men, converted by the pickets, earn their cheers. But production is continuing, say the Coal Board, despite the growing picket numbers. At some pits, the police have introduced new control techniques, isolating the colliery area so that pickets cannot reach miners clocking on. A police roadblock half a mile away stops and inspects all vehicles, and all potential pickets are turned back. There have been a number of arrests. 2 when police used a crowbar on the windscreen of a picket's car. But the coalfields' strike policy remains ambiguous.
They have a mandate by virtue of a majority of about 20,000 that they want to go to work. That is their fundamental right, and equally it is a fundamental right to respect picket lines.
The flying pickets don't recognise the Nottinghamshire miners' dilemma, and they threaten an even heavier picketing effort at selected pits on the coalfield overnight.
Britain's open cast miners have thrown their weight behind the NUM. The mines produce about 1/10 of the NCB's total output, and they're highly profitable. The coal's dug by private firms contracted to the Coal Board. That's why the workers are in the Transport and General Workers Union. Today, after hearing an appeal from the NUM, they voted not to release any of their coal.
Well, their fight is our fight. They are fighting for jobs, and they're also fighting to prevent imports of energy. Our people in open cast are also being made redundant. They're determined to support the miners in the fight for jobs.
It's the biggest boost the NUM's had from other unions. Some train drivers have refused to cross picket lines, and seamen have blocked some coal imports. But the main unions in the power stations have advised their members to ignore NUM pickets. The miners, anyway, have turned most of their energy against each other, and so far there's been no pressure on industry or the government.
The miners' president, Arthur Scargill, said today that the strike is widening. He says 85% of collieries have now stopped work. But Mr. Scargill said there was naked intervention by the government in the dispute. The police were operating as a paramilitary force, and he said the government seemed determined to smash not only the miners, but every trade union. The Home Office Minister Douglas Hurd said officers drafted into the Nottinghamshire area had been issued with equipment including riot shields under what he called standard arrangements. County councillors from Nottinghamshire met ministers to try to get help with the extra cost of policing. They estimate £3 million has been spent so far, and that will rise to £5 million by the end of the month.
The huge cost of the police operation, of which Nottingham must bear half, has been a shock at the end of the financial year. Already facing a penalty for overspending generally, the delegation was asking that their share of the police bill is given special treatment and not included in their normal budget.
The government have so far accepted that in the exceptional circumstances that Nottingham is facing, it would probably be wrong for us to have to pay penalties. But the government haven't yet made up its mind whether they will exempt us from penalties on the whole of the money or only a part of it.
Having got this concession, the councillors went on to the Home Office to seek an exceptional cash grant, but this time they were told no. Their police authority meets tomorrow when they must decide if they can afford their share of all the extra officers given the government's decisions.
McGregor's message to the miners: go back to work, I won't give in. But Scargill says we fight on. Good evening. The miners' strike is 2 weeks old tonight, and Ian McGregor thinks it's gone on long enough. The Coal Board chairman has appealed for a return to work on Monday, but he won't give in, and he says he's prepared to wait indefinitely if necessary. Arthur Scargill says the strike is now beginning to bite. Only 37 pits were open today, and he reckons domestic supplies are now in danger. David Steele is concerned about the role of flying pickets and the police. The Liberal leader has spoken of methods totally unacceptable. David Owen and the other SDP MPs are also worried about the police stopping Kent miners on their way to picket. And Labour MP Tony Benn said the actions the government had ordered were absolutely illegal. In the Nottinghamshire coalfield, police and pickets were again out in force. About 900 pickets from Yorkshire and South Wales arrived in the county, despite a big police presence and roadblocks turning some cars back. The Coal Board's chairman said today he felt those who wanted the strike to continue were in the minority.
I think that there is clear evidence that the majority of our people are a little bit shocked by the failure of the national executive to react to the majority's desires. And I think that the intimidation that so many people have been subjected to is totally un-British. And I am very confident that the good common sense of the bulk of our employees will ultimately come through.
So you're saying that even if this strike goes on for weeks, you're still not modifying your plan?
I haven't got any plans to change. I think that we've put forward a very, very intelligent, progressive plan for the industry. And I know that most of the people in the industry understand that, and they're perfectly prepared to go along with it.
So how long are you prepared to sit it out?
Definitely, as far as I'm concerned.
2 weeks into the dispute, and Mr McGregor's as resolute as ever, bolstered by the huge stocks of coal at power stations and the lack of any pressure or panic from industry. But today, the NUM President Arthur Scargill again accused the police of using paramilitary tactics. He appealed to Mr McGregor to stop what the union sees as the butchery of the coal industry. The NUM says the latest example is the colliery closure 3 weeks ago in South Yorkshire, which sparked off the strikes. The miners' union probably wouldn't have picked Corton Wood as the last ditch in its fight with Mr McGregor. At best, the Victorian collieries got only 5 years of reserves. But when the Coal Board said it would have to close within a couple of months, the miners were incensed. Pickets set up at the gates and the Yorkshire coalfield struck in sympathy. Soon Scotland followed, then Kent and South Wales. But that was by no means all the British coalfield. NUM leaders hoped every other area would fall in behind, like dominoes, till there was a national stoppage over Mr McGregor's plans to cut 20,000 jobs and reduce production by 4 million tonnes, measures which triggered the Corton Wood closure. Many miners, notably those in the productive Notts coalfield, don't see Yorkshire's fight as theirs. They want a national pithead ballot before joining the strikes. But the Yorkshiremen want Notts out now. That's why miners been fighting miner. And that's why 8,000 police have been drafted in to help men get into work. Their tactics have proved effective, but also controversial, especially stopping flying pickets before they can get near a pit. Production's been badly hit. 127 pits are closed, 12 are partly working and 37 are open. If Lancashire joins the strike on Monday, only one large area, Notts, stands in the way of a total pit shutdown. The dispute remains as bitter and unpredictable as ever. The Coal Board's still hoping the NUM will reconvene its national executive next week. There's probably a majority on the committee for a pithead ballot. But Mr. Scargill's showing no signs of calling a meeting, so the battle will continue on the picket lines, with the Notts miners still holding the key.
A miner who died while he was with a group of flying pickets was buried today, and a column of miners half a mile long followed his coffin. The dead man is David Jones, who was buried in the West Yorkshire mining village of South Kirby.
The NUM president, Arthur Scargill, arrives to offer his condolences at the family home. David Jones' father told him his son had died in the fight to save miners' jobs and their pits. About 3,500 miners from every coalfield gathered for the funeral. The mining village of South Kirby had stopped for an hour to pay a final tribute to a trainee pit deputy who died while on flying picket duty in the neighbouring Nottinghamshire coalfield. Miners now see David Jones as a martyr to the current strike battle, and the funeral procession was orchestrated on that scale. It's still a mystery how exactly David Jones died, but it happened on the night of the fiercest street scuffles between pickets and miners who wanted to work. David Jones' mother broke down as the cortege reached the parish church, and other members of the mining family comforted her. For Yorkshire miners and their union, David Jones was the unfortunate victim of a bitter struggle inside the coal industry against pit closures. But it doesn't make the grief any easier for the family. The NUM blames his death on an outside hooligan element who took advantage of the picketing to cause violence. Among the wreaths was one from the Nottinghamshire Police, who tried to handle the fighting when David Jones died outside Ollerton Colliery.
That's from the Calendar Studio, but now the national and international news from ITN at 1 o'clock.
Which enters its third week, and more flying pickets have been arrested. And at the Coal Board's Doncaster headquarters, 2 women were knocked to the ground when they arrived for work. There was heavy picketing there. In Nottinghamshire, 27 men from the Yorkshire area were detained by police during roadside checks aimed at limiting the number of pickets in the county. But it's estimated that 350 men did get through, and they're picketing most of the 25 pits in Nottinghamshire. 8 men were also arrested on picket lines at Cadley Hill colliery in South Derbyshire. 3 policemen were injured. The Lancashire coalfields were at a standstill today following an area decision to maintain unity despite a ballot against strike action. The shutdown was complete in Scotland, the North East, in Yorkshire, in Kent and South Wales. The Coal Board said this morning that 132 pits were idle, 37 were working normally, and that some work was being carried out at 7 pits. Colin Baker reports for us from the East Midlands.
Undoubtedly, this was the biggest to date of the military-style operations now being run by the police in Nottinghamshire. In the early hours, a cordon of thousands of policemen was slung around the Nottingham coalfields. Every vehicle and person was checked. The message was clear and simple. This was an operation to restrict movement, and the police were very much in control. The 3 pickets in the van had travelled more than 100 miles through side roads, but the cordon was virtually impenetrable. The police showed no dislike for the pickets, neither did they appear to enjoy their particular task.
Can I cash that in and ride about with Artie at Taxley's?
And how you feel, mate?
Well, what's I expect? We're going to end up with no jobs, aren't we? We might as well cash that tax disc in and ride about with Artie, don't we? That's what we paid to go on roads for, let's be fair.
I know. However,
That's
that's the situation as it is.
Where do we go now?
Home.
An ITN cameraman travelling with pickets recorded one encounter.
I'll leave it with you now, but you know where you stand. All right.
We know how we stand, so what you're saying is if we carry on to Thoresby Colliery, we will be arrested?
Any colliery.
Any colliery?
Basically, any colliery, you're going to be arrested. It's not just Thoresby, it's any colliery in the north.
And what are you doing with that list that you've just given us
Well,
with his name?
keeping hold of that. And then if you happens there's any more bother at all, or you turn up at the other pits, you're liable
to be arrested. Is that on any other day? Right,
no, that's today.
At Thoresby, Britain's most profitable pit, the way was clear for miners to work. Those few pickets who'd made it found themselves outnumbered. This miner had jogged 7 miles to make his protest at nearby Ollerton.
I've been in the pit 24 years, and I know nothing else, and I don't want to end up in this scrap heap. It's all right he's saying that people's got the right to work. Of course people's got the right to work. So it's 4 million. I don't want to be 4 million and one.
On the Doncaster-Nottingham road, the police prepared for a confrontation with pickets who'd walked 10 miles after being stopped at one roadblock. The scuffling was an expression not of anger, but of frustration, of being barred from making any kind of protest to their fellow miners. From being a struggle to gain solidarity, they now faced new odds which were too overwhelming, and defiance turned to despair.
We're not causing any obstruction. It's
fascist state! It's a fascist state, this!
After talks with senior officers, they left, saying that they would come back. Here on the Doncaster Road this morning, 5 people were arrested for breaching the peace. Colin Baker, News at 1, Nottinghamshire.
We go to the miners' dispute. The 13,000 miners in the NUM's Midlands area, which covered Staffordshire and Warwickshire, are being instructed to join the strike against pit closures from tomorrow morning. Although the men voted against going on strike by a majority of 5 to 2 last week, 7 of the area's 11 pits have since stopped work. Today, the area executive of the union decided to make the strike official. Their secretary said the mood of the men had changed since last week.
Today, we heard from every delegate from every pit in our area, Warwickshire, Cannock and North Staffordshire. And the stories of the violence and the threat to our members was sorry to hear. We were also informed about minor falling out with minor.
Isn't that because of the heavy-handed picketing?
No, it may be because of the heavy-handed police. Because the police, I believe, are overstepping their mark. And I will repeat again that the area council took its decision today to try and avoid the violence which we think will come unless we take a hold of the situation.
Well, another 5 pits have stopped work since Friday. 132 pits are now on strike or picketed out, and 6 are partly working. That's 6 fewer than on Friday. Another 38 pits, all in high-producing areas like Nottinghamshire, are still working normally, and that's 1 up on the end of last week. Today, the police mounted a massive operation to keep pickets away from those pits which are still at work.
Undoubtedly, this was the biggest to date of the military-style operations now being run by the police in Nottinghamshire. In the early hours, a cordon of thousands of policemen was slung around the Nottingham coalfields. Every vehicle and person was checked. The message was clear and simple. This was an operation to restrict movement, and the police were very much in control. Police prepared for a confrontation with pickets who'd walked 10 miles after being stopped at one roadblock. The scuffling was an expression not of anger, but of frustration, of being barred from making any kind of protest to their fellow miners. From being a struggle to gain solidarity, they now faced new odds which were too overwhelming, and defiance turned to despair.
We're not causing any obstruction. It's
fascist state! It's a fascist state, this!
After talks with senior officers, they left, saying that they would come back. Here on the Doncaster Road this morning, 5 people were arrested for breaching the peace.
The difference was that in Lancashire, the stoppage for a week was said to mean just that, a week and no more. There, as in other areas which originally voted against a strike, the demand is for a national ballot. Well, Julian O'Halloran has been taking the temperature at one of Lancashire's most moderately minded pits, where feelings are running pretty high.
The Lancashire coalfield is hardly the most significant in the country. It has only 7 pits and just over 6,000 miners. But what is happening there can hardly be reassuring to the NUM leaders. Up until the end of last week,
Pits like the Agecroft colliery at Swinton on the outskirts of Manchester had been an irritant to those in the miners' union trying to achieve a 100% strike. The men at the Lancashire pits had voted in the ratio of 60 to 40 against striking. But last Thursday, a delegate conference called on the men to stop work for a week. Over the last few days, the Lancashire pits have fallen in with this call. And yesterday, the majority of the 830 men at the Agecroft colliery gathered to make their decision. They agreed by a slim majority to stop work for a week. But was it the victory for Yorkshire and the strikers that it seemed?
I'm quite happy with it. The result this morning.
Why do you think the men here have changed their minds and agreed not to work for a week?
Because of pressure, generally from the area executive.
What is the area executive trying to achieve by this?
Well, so they say, unity within this coalfield.
And when they've got unity within this coalfield?
Well, then they can put pressure on the national executive to have a national ballot.
Oh. We're starting back on the 2nd of April, come what may.
So why are you coming out for a week?
To force Scargill into giving us a democratic vote.
We should have a national ballot.
Do you think that staying away from work for a week will help to achieve it?
No, we're only hoping so. We don't think so. Personally, I don't think so, but we're hoping so.
We've been railroaded. We've had 5 ballots now. And our union's worked it for us to suit themselves.
Why do you think that they want to bring you out for a week?
They'll have to get a national ballot. They'll never get it now.
Why not?
Well, what's the point? He's already got us out, hasn't he?
They've succumbed to pressure from the area executive. Sid Vincent wants to be able to go to Yorkshire to the meetings and hold his head up and say Lancashire are out, and they've fiddled it and they've had vote after vote after vote until finally it's gone their way and they've got the last pit in the area out on strike.
Arthur Scargill is not taking that ballot box away us. We want a vote, a national vote, either everybody on strike or everybody back in.
And what will happen if you don't get a national ballot?
Then we're going back to work and sod Scargill.
While the men of Agecroft and the other Lancashire pits spend the week cooling their heels in the miners' clubs or at home, it's hard to see how their leadership can force a national executive meeting. The theory is that the representatives of moderate areas on the miners' national executive would have more moral authority in calling for a national ballot if their men had at least given temporary and united support for the striking areas.
As long as we stick together, that's what we'll have to do now.
But few men at Agecroft believe that this temporary involvement in strike action will in any way increase their commitment to the Yorkshire miners' cause. If anything, the opposite.
Scenes that I've witnessed at Agecroft and at other coalfields, Nottingham, Staffordshire, etc., they've saddened me. It's put miner against miner. And the tactics that they're using, it's not just split this union, it's shattered it.
When you say it's shattered it, do you mean that the damage won't be able to be repaired in the future?
Well, at Agecroft, we've had unity, and I'm proud to say this. And in 72 and 74, I was proud to lead them out on strike. But no way am I taking men on strike with their arms up the back. And this, as far as I'm concerned, is what's happening at present.
The unwillingness of Agecroft men to strike isn't based on job security. It's become known as a dads and lads pit, because of the belief that it's nearly impossible for a young man to be taken on unless his father also works there. The workforce has been halved in the last 2 decades, and more job losses are expected. But it's the redundancy terms which could be reinforcing anti-strike opinion.
Well, for me, I'm hoping for another 5 years at pit and then finishing at 50. And then I'll be quite satisfied with that.
Terry Knight has worked for 29 years as a coal cutter. Under the Coal Board's old scheme, he calculated that if he was made redundant, he stood to get about £8,000. But under the new, far more generous terms, he believes sacrificing his job could be worth up to 4 times that much. Given that he has no mortgage worries, he lives in a £22 a week council house, could it be the prospect of this golden handshake that's influencing his thinking on the current dispute?
I'm hoping Agecroft doesn't shut because I have a lad there, young lad there. But if it did, it'd have put another 25 grand in my back pocket. on top of my redundancy. And £32,000, which what it amounted, what it would be, it makes a lot of difference.
Would it make a difference to the way you might vote in a ballot about a strike to prevent pit closures, do you think?
It could sway me a bit, that, yeah. It could.
This morning, though, Terry Knight and other reluctant strikers of Agecroft were at home as their colleagues mounted a small and orderly picket on their own colliery. Only members of other unions, white-collar staff and those involved in safety and maintenance went through the gates.
I blame the whole NEC committee for not being strong enough to say that we're going to the lads and we're having a ballot. I don't blame any individual person.
You see, Mr. Scargill would say that it's pure selfishness on the part of miners in other areas not to join with those whose pits are immediately facing the threat of closure.
Agecroft Colliery is one of the most vulnerable pits in the country. We used to have a manpower of 1,800 men with 5 coal faces. By September of this year, we'll have a manpower level of 720 with 1 coal face. So it's not a case of bugger you, I'm all right, Jack. We are on the hit list.
So why are your men here so reluctant to go on strike?
Because, as far as we're concerned, the democratic right to ballot is being taken away from us, and that's the whole crux of the issue.
What we've said today, we're having a week's strike on the recommendation...
In the Terry Knight household, debate has been vigorous. And Terry and his friend Sid Bullock, who's also been a miner for 3 decades, have heard harsh words from their wives.
April the 2nd.
Yeah, but all the media will see is that there are no pits in Lancashire working. We were all proud of you last week when you were the only pits in Lancashire to produce coal. It only takes one to stand up to all this. Where's democracy? You've had your vote, they've just thrown it out. You've let yourselves down, you've let Lancashire down, you've let the industry down, and you've let democracy down.
And given into dictatorship.
Well, if it's a long strike, Sid, there's going to be pits that will never open again, that maybe had a couple of more years' life, that will never open again.
This is what the NUM's thought of.
Now, they're all saying it's propaganda from the NUM, but surely it's common sense.
Oh, it is common sense. I mean, if this strike goes on, and warm weather's coming, there'll be some pits.
You'll be out for a
It'll
while.
never open again.
True. Where's it all going to end?
We'll see Monday. I mean, the lads today back our local executive, who have took some stick.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's the first time in 20 years they've all been behind our exec. But we'll have to see.
We'll have this week's strike out, and if it doesn't give us a national ballot, the men at Agecroft Colliery is going to work.
Well, I hope they do.
Oh, they will. Oh, they will.
According to the domino theory of this strike, the decision not to work at Agecroft Colliery ought to mean that men in yet another coalfield have been hitched firmly to the strikers' bandwagon. Yet with the Agecroft miners, this clearly isn't the case. And the Lancashire miners' leader, Mr. Sid Vincent, has told me that he thinks that men at other Lancashire pits will be back at work next week. Already, one North Wales colliery has returned to work after the men there initially joined the strike. The question is whether these are isolated pockets of resistance or whether they represent some kind of turning of the tide that was flowing in the favour of Mr. Scargill and the other strike leaders.
Well, Paul Routledge is Labour editor of The Times. Paul, what would be your progress report tonight? On the one hand, we have seen the strike spreading. At the same time, there in Lancashire, we've seen at what cost it's spreading and the bitterness of those people. Now, is it going Mr. Scargill's way or Mr. McGregor's?
At the moment, it looks as if it's going Mr. Scargill's way, because the areas are coming out one by one in the domino theory that we talked about earlier on the programme, and more pits are closing down.
Will the Lancashire miners, do you think, at the end of this week, if there's no national ballot, will they go back to work?
We always call them a barometer area. They're the kind of men who typify what happens in the industry. If the Lancashire miners go on strike, if the North Derbyshire miners vote to go on strike, then there will be a stoppage in the whole industry. If the NUM executive is called together and it puts out to a ballot and they vote for a stoppage, then there will be a national strike without any question. The difficulty now lies, of course, between here and there. will Scargill call the EC together to get that ballot going.
Well, now, what do you think his strategy is? Do you think he is, in the end, going to call a national ballot?
Well, he must, under rule. It's a wait-and-see operation. It's a very, very tight game.
Why must he by the rules? Not surely unless the majority of the executive think he should.
Well, the EC cannot itself, because it can't be called together unless Mr. Scargill and his General Secretary actually call the EC together. They can't decide unless they're brought together to decide. So when they are brought together, I think they will actually go for a ballot and they will recommend a strike. That could be 3 weeks away, and by that time we may be well into the 4th or 5th week of a strike, and by that time there may well be sufficient impetus for a stoppage.
Now, why do you think that? Are you saying that as time goes on, a national ballot is likelier to lead to a strike than not?
Well, history tells us that is the case. In 72, in 69, all the previous ballots have demonstrated that the longer you hold out on limited industrial action, the more likely the members are to vote for a stoppage. They've done that in the past.
I mean, do you think there's any chance of Mr. Scargill going for a ballot unless he's... I mean, how can he be sure that he can win?
It isn't Mr. Scargill, it's the entire executive of the NUM.
The majority of the executive...
the executive of the NUM has to actually get its act together and say what we want to do. And at the moment, they seem to be incapable of doing that. They are divided about whether or not to have a special EC. And when they actually get together, they have to decide where they go from here. At the moment, because there's no leadership within the old moderate wing of the NUM executive, there is no obvious place where to go, and there is no natural and obvious direction towards a ballot.
But what do you think Mr. Scargill's own personal strategy is?
I am not privy to Mr. Scargill's internal thoughts. I would have thought that the left on the executive will be wanting to hold off from a ballot as long as possible in the hope that the present disruption in the industry will gain such momentum that when they do hold a ballot, that it will yield the 55% plus majority that they want for an all-out strike.
Now, will the miners on their own, whether they have a successful national ballot for a strike or not, will the miners on their own win this strike in the long run?
Well, why not? I mean, in the past, people always said it was a suicide strike in 72. I remember one of my best colleagues saying that. You can't say. In 81, this government, Mr. Thatcher's government, said rather than stand and fight, we'll run and lose. How can we tell? It's quite possible that they will lose, but nobody can tell until you get into a dispute, because every dispute has its own internal logic and proceeds under that.
So where does the TUC come in? I mean, why, for example, so far have the miners not gone for help from the TUC?
Because the TUC doesn't really offer very much. What can the TUC offer? I mean, today they had a letter from the union in which they said they didn't really want any help from the TUC. And when they went to the TUC in 1972, they passed a plastic bucket around the general account of the TUC and put money into it. That wasn't what they were really after. They were looking for support from other unions, and that's what they might get if they ask for it. That's more important than asking the TUC for it.
Paul Rightly, thank you very much indeed.
Afternoon with Richard Whitmore and Francis Coverdale.
Convoys of miners have been causing chaos on the A1 in Yorkshire by driving along it at 5 miles an hour. Domestic coal stocks are dwindling. There's said to be only 2 or 3 weeks' supply nationally, less than that in some areas.
We look at the
convoy of miners has blocked part of the A1 motorway in Yorkshire. Police have had to close off a 12-mile stretch of the road as long tailbacks have built up. The miners are drawing attention to their strike by driving at 5 miles an hour up and down the motorway between Walmsworth and Blythe. Meanwhile, coal supplies at 3 power stations near Selby have now dried up because of the strike.
At Eggborough, all coal coming in by road was stopped. Lorries didn't even arrive because drivers were told they'd be turned back. 13 trains usually run coal supplies from Yorkshire Pits to Eggborough and the neighbouring power stations of Ferrybridge and Drax. These two are now idle because the rail unions are telling drivers and guards not to cross miners' picket lines. There's no immediate prospect of power cuts, but the pickets could cause some local electricity shortages. particularly if they spread their blockade.
At this particular power station, that they do have a large capacity for putting coal on the ground. What we have seen in the last fortnight, going around the country, especially in Lancashire, is that there's many power stations there with very little coal on the ground. And we do believe that it will have a great effect far quicker than anybody anticipates.
The generating board have 24 million tonnes of coal at power stations. These stocks are crucial, but even movements a few hundred yards to power plants could be in jeopardy if miners tighten their grip around power stations.
One effect of the strike is that domestic coal is in short supply. Nationally, stocks will last for only 2 or 3 weeks. And in the northeast, coal merchants are now cooperating in a scheme to help needy families, as Alan Powers reports.
There are 100,000 tonnes of domestic coal at this dump near Ashington in Northumberland. Up till now, the only coal to leave the depot during the strike has gone to mining pensioners and widows. But from today, private coal merchants throughout the northeast are allowed to make collections, provided they've got permits approved by the NUM. The union and the coal board have agreed to allow families suffering particular hardship to have 4 hundredweights per household. These include pensioners, the chronically ill and disabled, and families with very young children. Armed with a list of 84 families, Blythe coal merchant Michael Johnston picked up his first wagon load today. And with him, to see that the coal gets to its destination, a miners' union representative.
So will you be going to each house as well?
Oh, yes. Have a look in the coal house, see that they've got nothing. And if they've got nothing, they get their 4 bags.
It's a bit like a security exercise.
It is in a way, but everyone tries to get on the bandwagon, as you well appreciate, and only here to see fair play. Obviously, some people aren't going to have any coal at all, and they're not going to be on the list. So if you've got a couple of bags spare, I'm sure that Mr. Johnson will be only too willing to let them have a couple of bags.
At Cadley Hill in South Derbyshire, there was the biggest turnout of pickets seen since the strike began, but in general, picketing was peaceful.
More than 1,000 pickets from the North Derbyshire, South Wales and Kent coalfields were at Cadley Hill by the time miners on the morning shift started turning up for work. Police from forces as far away as Cornwall were drafted in to cope. Senior officers wouldn't say how many policemen were on duty, but they way outnumbered the pickets, and reinforcements kept on arriving throughout the morning. Only 6 pickets were allowed through the police cordons to try to persuade the Cadley men to join the strike. Most listened and then drove in. There were some scuffles as pickets pushed and shoved against the police lines. After one incident, a picket was dragged from the crowd and led away. Later, there was another arrest. The window of a bus was smashed as it drove through the colliery gates. The pickets claimed that many Cadley men were now staying away, and most of those going in were safety men. They certainly scored one small victory. There won't be any milk at Cadley Hill Pit today.
134 pits have now been closed by the strike, 38 are working normally and 4 are partly manned. At one pit in North Staffordshire, 4 miners are staging their own work-in. They say they intend to stay down the pit until a national ballot is held to resolve the dispute.
As you may have heard in the national news, flying pickets from Yorkshire changed their tactics in the pit dispute today. As many as 300 vehicles drove at a crawling pace along both carriageways of the A1 motorway near the border with Nottinghamshire. The southbound carriageway was closed between Wadworth and Blythe for 90 minutes. 8 police officers were injured, none of them seriously, outside Cole House, the NCB's Doncaster headquarters this morning. 21 pickets were arrested while trying to stop coal board staff entering the building. They'll be appearing before Doncaster magistrates this afternoon. About 200 pickets were present in all. Nottinghamshire had less picketing than at any time for the last fortnight because of an increased police presence. 9 men were arrested in the county.
Today, 400 policemen were there to make sure the clerical staff could get into work. Trouble started as the first of the workers arrived. Faced with a crowd of angry miners, most of the office workers waited nervously a few hundred yards away while the police cleared a passage to the building. Eventually, they were escorted in. The police had agreed they could be approached, but only by a small official picket.
Now, the only thing I would say is this, that if I get any interference,
then I shall close ranks to guarantee everyone's best protection. Right. If we can maintain this agreed understanding, gentlemen, I'll be most grateful. Right.
But as the office workers ignored the pickets' appeals to turn back, the frustration was too much for a crowd of around 500 miners who burst through the police ranks. 7 police officers were slightly hurt, 1 needed hospital treatment. 21 miners were arrested.
Gently, boys.
The coal boards say all but a handful of their 1,000 staff turned in for work. Paul Davis, News at 1 in Doncaster.
At Cadley Hill Colliery in South Derbyshire, small numbers of pickets were allowed to talk to miners going into work. Hundreds of police held back the majority of pickets, estimated at over 1,000 men, and all the local miners who turned up for work went in, with none seen turning back. There were numerous scuffles as the morning shift arrived for work, and there were a few arrests. Vehicles arriving at the colliery were occasionally stoned. Look at the side window just behind the driver on the bus which arrives next. It was shattered by a stone. To get into work safely, some of the men at Cadley Heath have been arriving hours before they're due to clock on. Others have been walking across fields to avoid the picket lines. Some local miners claim of being assaulted by pickets. Others have had their cars smashed. So far, they seem determined to continue going to work. At dawn, the pickets left for breakfast, promising to return when the next shift arrived for work. And half an hour ago, police and pickets began to form lines again, with the afternoon shift due to report on at 1:30.
Drove in convoy at 5 miles an hour up and down the motorway between Wadworth and Blythe, causing huge tailbacks of traffic. Police say around 100 vehicles were trapped in the blockade, and they closed the southbound carriageway until they were able to clear the tailback. The road is now clear.
By many on the left of the union. Well, it's happened, of course, while Mr. Scargill is in London. He's attending a court case and he's presenting the union's evidence against the National Coal Board, yes. He's away, and so is the other senior official of the union, Peter Heathfield. And I think the important point about this is that for the first time, the moderates have come together and have forced this into a public issue, which it hasn't been before, and that's the danger for Mr. Scargill. In a word, yes or no, will they succeed in getting the ballot? I think they will bring a ballot more likely, yes, than it has been before.
Thank you. Well, this rebellion, call it what you will, comes just as claims are being made that the strike is biting and that parts of the country are now running out of coal. It was only on Friday that the Coal Board chairman, Ian McGregor, repeated the blunt assurances that he gave in January that no matter what the miners do, stocks are so good that we can hold out indefinitely, he said. But yesterday, as we entered the 3rd week of the strike, British Steel at Scunthorpe announced that they were having to cut production back by half. Today came the news that in Scotland, coal merchants supplying householders have in some parts only a week's supply to go. And iron foundries in the English Midlands have warned that they might have to stop production before the week is out. So, who's kidding who? Well, there's none better to ask than the Coal Board's Director General of Marketing, Malcolm Edwards.
I'm not in the kidding business, I'm in the coal business. Now, as far as power stations are concerned, there is 23 million tonnes on the sites of the power stations. They don't have to go through picket lines, the right quality, the right place. It's 6 months endurance.
So
a lot of inconvenience for the power stations, but 6 months endurance.
So when Arthur Scargill says that there are only about 10 weeks supply at power stations, you're saying that's wrong?
As in so many other things, yes, he's wrong.
And what about industry?
Industry, by and large, is well stocked. There have been these problems at Scunthorpe, which you've heard about, which got itself, for a lot of local reasons, with low stocks. But this only points to the moral. I mean, there is a consumer that has been 100% loyal to local British coal. It burns over 1 million tonnes of Yorkshire coal, and yet it is the one that's going to suffer. I find this crazy. It has its ironic side, mind you, because the NUM headquarters started to run out of coal last week, and we have, by the rules we operate with the NUM in Yorkshire, we have no coal available for that class of customer. So the distributor's done his best, and he's put in a load of non-NCB coal. We think it's a mixture of private coal with some imports, American perhaps or Polish, into the NUM's headquarters. It's surely that point's the crazy part of this exercise. The only people we're damaging are ourselves. Now, as far as the domestic consumer is concerned, we're right at the end of the heating season. There is perhaps 3 or 4 weeks, the heating season still to go. There is enough stock in the system. If people will shop around, they won't get their first choice, I'm sorry to say. And some merchants are low on stock, but others will have stock.
Are you, though, saying that there is no way that the NUM could win this strike, however long it goes on?
I cannot see how they can possibly win it. I just cannot see it. But why do they do this? I mean, what they're putting at risk, in what state is the market going to be at the end of this? I mean, BSC is in the mess that it's in now because it had a 3-month strike. It lost its markets as a result of that strike. This is what we must not do. And the management of this industry is determined that that is not what we're going to do.
The clock.
New development in the miners' dispute. 10 of the 24 members of the union's executive now say, we want a national ballot. 4 miners who want to work have staged a sit-in at a pit in the Midlands, but elsewhere on the surface, their striking colleagues hit the supply of coal to power stations. First tonight, though, news of a secret meeting of 7 members of the miners' union's national executive. The 7 called for all miners who have voted against a strike in local ballots to cross picket lines and to return to work. They also want the executive to call a national ballot. The meeting was held at a pub in Grubby in Leicestershire, and apart from the men present, 3 other NEC members sent their support. That means at least 10 of the 24-man NEC are now in favour of a national ballot. The areas represented at the meeting included Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire, the Midlands and South Derbyshire. Elsewhere, the leaders of the 2 biggest rail unions expressed support for the strike. Jimmy Knapp of the NUR and Ray Buckton of ASLEF will meet miners' leaders later this evening to find ways of making their support for the strike more effective. The TUC General Council will discuss the strike tomorrow. Meanwhile, the Coal Board and the Miners' Union have been trying out some new tactics today. These included the blockade of the motorway and a press conference held down a pit. And as for local coal production, the position this afternoon was little changed. 134 pits were on strike or stopped by pickets, 3 were partly working, and 38 were working normally. The most dramatic new tactic on show today seemed to have been copied from the French lorry drivers. Miners drove a convoy of cars slowly up the A1M in South Yorkshire. 4 men at the Hem Heath pit in Staffordshire are staging a sit-in. They say they'll stay down the pit until a national ballot is called.
With 4 of their miners sitting in at the coalface and demanding the right to work, the National Coal Board were understandably keen to take journalists down to meet them. So they held a unique press conference at the bottom of the pit shaft. 1,000 feet below ground in Staffordshire's Hem Heath colliery, 4 men stepped forward to meet a barrage of photographers and tell their story. Together with the rest of their colleagues here, they'd voted not to strike, but then found themselves ordered out by local union officials. They say they took the decision without consulting their families or their colleagues.
We had our vote, they voted work. Then the bully boys come in and stop the blokes as a fright and come in work.
So how long are you going to stay down here for?
Until we get some satisfaction out the union. And we don't want to see our union man, we want to see somebody from the executive. Somebody who can give us a straight answer.
Would you like to see Scargill down here?
Oh, definitely. Oh, we'd love to see Arthur Scargill,
What would you tell him?
Well,
tell him get off his high horse and talk a bit of common bloody sense. When we were getting changed in the baths, bricks coming through the baths window. Now, our union man said the police cause all the trouble. Well, in my eyes, the police haven't caused any trouble. They did a good job. Because if without the police, we'd have been practically lynched.
The men say they'll stay below ground as long as it takes, playing cards to keep themselves amused. Above ground today, it was the usual story of police and pickets. All miners who wanted to work in Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire were able to do so, although at Cadley Hill they faced 1,000 pickets.
A massive police operation to ensure that the miners who want to go to work do get through the picket lines has been largely successful. Today, for example, more than 5,500 police were on picket duty, outnumbering the pickets by more than 2 to 1. And that has led to a significant change of strategy by the striking miners. While some flying pickets are still being sent out to the coalfields, others are now being diverted to picket power stations. Edward Sturton has been charting the latest developments with the North Yorkshire pitmen.
What's your name, please, mate?
T.C. Miller.
This is just the sort of incident that has forced the Yorkshire miners to review their picketing strategy. These men left base early this morning by different routes to avoid the police. Yet they found themselves together in a queue behind a police roadblock just short of Silverhill Colliery in Nottinghamshire. Frustrated, the pickets were determined to make the police explain their actions publicly.
Well, you just come alongside with me.
Oh, well, talk here. All right. You know where everybody can see us. Why do you suspect us of causing a breach of the peace?
I told you, you were told before.
No, you haven't explained to us.
Your presence here gives me cause to suspect that a breach of the peace will occur.
They were led away in a convoy headed by a police van, and when they stopped to call their strike headquarters for further instructions, they were still watched closely by the police escort.
Strike headquarters says we should try again.
When the second attempt to reach Silverhill was thwarted, one of the men gave the police notice of their new target.
You better get your lads on power stations next.
The possibility of picketing power stations had dominated much of yesterday's planning at the men's strike headquarters in Nottingley. Operating on instructions from the Yorkshire area offices at Barnsley, the team here decides how many men to send where and when.
We would like you for later on this afternoon if you can manage it, John.
And the message from those coming back here from Nottinghamshire during the day was clear.
You were picketing on the early shift in Nottingham today. How did you get on?
To be truthful, not very well, because of the police. We weren't allowed to put his opinion across to the Nottingham members. A chance to talk. A chance to talk. And they're not given that chance to talk, are they? 100 yards away, what can you do? Shout.
With that frustration in mind, the man who runs the strike headquarters considered how to respond to the police operation.
It's clear that we will need to rethink our tactics and operate like a military exercise. We will create diversions, we will picket power stations, we will picket railways, we will picket fuel depots, and perhaps draw the police away from the Nottingham area, hopefully anyway, because they can't be everywhere. But we intend to stop British industry. Let's make that absolutely clear. I'm expecting to start tomorrow, perhaps even tonight, picketing power stations.
During the afternoon, as men waited to find out where they'd be sent, it became clear that the picketing of power stations was indeed the next step. New placards were already being prepared for the men to take out with them. And by nightfall, a decision had been made, and pickets to the power stations were being mobilized.
We're not trying to picket the power workers themselves. We're trying to stop coal and oil and any other ancillary stuff going into the power stations to try and stop it that way. We're in no way at all are we going to interfere with the power workers themselves. We're not asking them to back us by a strike or anything. We're just asking them to, or asking the drivers not to go in, because there's a lot of coal going in through the doors in lorries, through the gates in lorries, and by rail.
At 10 p.m, the first pickets left for power stations. Nottingley is close to 3 large electricity plants usually served by local pits. This team had been told to cover Eggborough. Only a small number of pickets are assigned to each entrance, despite the strategic importance of the power stations to the miners' action. That's because the men believe they have the support of the transport union workers who deliver fuel here by road, and an agreement with the train drivers union that will stop it coming in by rail. There's actually very few of you here. The trains come in further down into the entrance. What can you actually achieve by being here?
Well, just by being here, we've an agreement with the train drivers that if there's pickets here, our union will inform the drivers or their union, and they said they won't go through, although we can't get to them.
So you think by just 4 of you being at this entrance, for example, you can actually stop the movement of coal into the power station?
Part of us should be quite sufficient to do that.
The miners say they haven't had to stop any fuel coming in here since the picketing began last night. But they remain convinced that it's at the power stations that they can test the claim that stocks are high enough to last for a prolonged strike. Some even say they could shut the power stations down in 3 weeks. Edward Sturton, ITN, North Yorkshire.
The Central Electricity Generating Board said today they had sufficient supplies of coal to fuel 6 months of normal operations. But despite holding such massive stocks, currently standing at 24.25 million tonnes, such is their dependence on coal, and given the risk of further disruption, they've been forced to examine contingency plans for when those stocks begin to run short. The CEGB achieve 82% of their output from coal-fired power stations. A further 14% comes from nuclear-powered stations, and a mere 4% from oil-fired stations. But the main reason for such a small contribution from the oil-powered sector is purely economic. When the price of oil shot up in the 70s, many oil-fired power stations became too costly to run. The electricity they made was too expensive. Nevertheless, the power stations are still there, and in extreme circumstances could be brought back on stream at a far higher work rate. The Central Electricity Generating Board have 4 2,000-megawatt oil-fired stations, which along with a couple of smaller installations could at full pelt produce 32% of all the electricity used in Britain. The normal reliance on coal for so much electricity is simple. Coal is cheaper than oil, and it's usually in plentiful supply. But the strike has changed that, and forced the Generating Board to examine contingency plans for a switch to oil. For the time being, such a move would only be a short-term measure. But if more nuclear power stations eventually come on stream, or there was a dramatic fall in the price of oil, the pattern could alter in the long term as well. So in the meantime, the Generating Board are preparing to move into the spot market for fuel oil, and will start buying unless the strike ends and coal deliveries return to normal.
We're taking a short break now. When we come back, we hope to be talking to one of the miners involved in that secret meeting today, which called for a national ballot. 10 of the members of the National Executive of the NUM decided to call for a national ballot. We have on the line, I hope to have on the line, Mr. Jack Collins of the Kent Miners Union. Mr. Collins, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Mr. Collins, what is your reaction to that meeting which was held in Leicestershire today, which calls for a national ballot?
Well, I'm amazed to find that people from the National Executive who haven't taken a decision only a couple of weeks ago to support those people who want to go on strike are now calling secretive meetings. I'm even more amazed when the same people, Jack Jones in particular, will not allow Kent miners to meet Leicestershire miners in the traditional way. He encourages the police to stop us meeting them, so I'm very, very amazed and extremely angry at the attitude of those 10 renegades.
I can understand your amazement and your anger, Mr. Collins, but what do you think is the significance of it? Will the call for this national ballot now increase, and will it be the inevitable end to all this?
You see, the situation is this. Those people are wishing to ballot the members in order not to strike. In other words, they're wanting to vote in order to vote other people like the Kent miners out of a job. And no miner in Britain has got the right to put a cross on a bit of paper and thereby sack another miner, because after all, it's the coal board that employs us. We don't employ each other. And for anybody to think that they have got that authority, it's got nothing to do with democracy, but in my opinion, it's the ethics of the rat race.
But do they have their pulse, you feel, on something here which they could really capitalize on? Do you think that this call for a national ballot is going to grow?
There are more, numerically, more miners on strike than what there are work. There are more miners on strike than those people collectively represent. One of the people who I believe was there represents the white-collar section, which is 20,000 people, the majority of whom don't work underground. There are a couple of other people from very, very small coal fields, and they don't really represent a very big section numerically of the miners.
Mr. Collins.
Jack Jones, the leader of the Leicestershire miners, said, "We must be assured that the majority want to take strike action. This union is above one man." Peter Heathfield, the General Secretary of the NUM, when told by journalists what had happened, said, "I am astonished that the right have had a caucus meeting in the delicate situation we face." John Thorne talked to some of the miners' leaders as they left this afternoon's meeting.
The meeting had been planned among executive moderates like Trevor Bell and Roy Ottey, in all the leadership of 13 NUM areas representing more than half Britain's mine workers. The idea was to gather secretly and consolidate a united front demanding that Mr. Scargill call an immediate national pithead ballot. And the moderates encouraged all miners who voted against strike action to defy the pickets and keep on working.
Where a democratic vote has been taken not to strike, or where the members have been advised to continue working until a national ballot vote is taken, to endeavour to work normally whilst continuing to apply the overtime ban guidelines.
We're concerned for the National Union, and we're concerned that we have a position where miner is fighting miner, and we don't like this. Also, there are now 14 areas, a majority of the National Union, calling for a national ballot vote, and we're being ignored.
These moderate NUM leaders abhor the chaos the flying pickets have brought to their coalfields. Now they're publicly ranged against the union hardliners from Yorkshire and elsewhere. It may just bring a ballot date that much closer.
Today's meeting is a direct challenge to the national officials. It demonstrates publicly what's been apparent privately for some days, that if the executive were to be called together, there would be a narrow majority for a national ballot, if executive members voted according to their area's decision. But that's been known for a while, and there's no more sign tonight of any meeting until the executive has its next scheduled one, in a fortnight's time. Meanwhile, the officials are concentrating on trying to make the strike effective. That means particularly affecting the transport of coal, a key ingredient in the miners' success in both the strikes in the 1970s. Today, the leaders of the two railway unions, the miners' old ally Ray Buckton from ASLEF and a newer one, Jimmy Knapp from the National Union of Railwaymen, called for an urgent meeting of transport unions to step up action. That's expected to take place on Thursday. A total stop in movement could speedily hit pits now working and could be important.
Was to achieve solidarity between those members of the executive who are calling for a national ballot and a recall National Executive Committee. We believe that the future of the union is at stake, and to achieve unity, then we need a democratic national ballot vote.
If you were
the union is bigger than we are, the national officials, or any individual.
If you were seeking solidarity, does that mean you accept Mr. Heathfield's stricture that you were in fact a right-wing caucus?
I don't accept that at all. As far as we're concerned, we are concerned about the National Union of Mine Workers. And as I say, we as individuals recognise that the future of the union is at stake with all the things that are going on and which are reported to us daily.
But Mr. Heathfield has said tonight, as we've reported, that he's not going to call an emergency executive meeting.
Well, it's rather remarkable to us. We have said today quite strongly that the national officials, whilst recognising the democratic decisions taken in areas who want to strike, are refusing to recognise the democratic decisions taken in areas who do not want to strike. Now, we appreciate that those areas who do want to strike within Rule 41 should be allowed to do so. But we also recognise the right of those areas who have voted not to strike. And we're calling upon the national officials to also recognise that position and issue instructions accordingly.
Well, here with me in London, as you know, is Jack Collins of the Kent Miners. Isn't it perfectly fair, as he says, that those who have already voted at local level against strike action shouldn't be intimidated into striking?
Well, I'd remind Roy Ottey that the people who destroyed the German trade union movement before the war met in pubs. As far as we are concerned, people who want a ballot, I'd ask Roy Ottey, what do he want a ballot for? If he wants a ballot in order to bring miners on strike, why doesn't he say so? But he doesn't. You see, he wants a ballot in order to overrule the decision of those men that are already on strike. In actual fact, Roy Ottey is calling for a non-strike. In other words, what he's really asking for is for the right of his members and other members to be given the authority to sack miners in Kent by putting a cross on a bit of paper, because he'll never advocate action in defence of the miners. How can a man who has always worked against the miners support the miners? How can a man who is a member of the Electricity Generating Board receiving a nice little handout from them expect to fight for miners?
But to repeat Mr. Ottey's point to you, are you not responsible for wanting a strike even against the wishes of those who've already indicated they don't want to follow that course?
It is not a question of the Kent miners wanting other people to strike. The Kent miners and other miners are saying, we have taken a decision. We are the people that are going to be sacked in the immediate future. And we are asking those people to recognise our picket lines, to stand with us and stand like men, stand like miners, and don't listen to the coal board bosses. Don't do the coal board bosses' job. That's what Ottey has done all of his life, advocate fighting against the miners.
Mr. Ottey, what do you say to that very serious charge?
I think it's rather remarkable that Jack Collins can prejudge what would be the outcome of a national individual ballot. As far as we're concerned, all of us today at this meeting, we have members exactly the same as people in the Kent area who are afraid for the future of their jobs. I could mention 3 collieries at least where my members are working, and I'm sure my colleagues could mention a lot more. We're not prepared to acknowledge that our members would not indeed vote for strike action in support of what the union are demanding in relation to pit closures.
Can I just clear up, for the sake of the viewers, one important point that Mr. Collins has put to you, which is, are you really in favour of no strike, not simply in favour of a national vote on a strike? Your real position is you don't want a strike at all.
My area executive council, whom I fully support, have called upon the National Executive Committee and the national officials to call a national ballot vote in support of strike action. We can't be any more firm than that.
Roy Ottey was one of the people that when the miners had a ballot on the incentive scheme and the miners threw the incentive scheme out, Roy Ottey was one of the men that went around the back door and conspired with other people to bring it in.
Well, we can't go into all the details of internal NUM politics, but are you saying, Mr. Collins, that are you implying that when you say you don't want a national strike ballot, are you actually afraid that you wouldn't win it? And if not, if so, why not?
No, as far as I'm concerned, I'm never frightened of meeting miners. I would say to Roy Ottey, to Jack Jones and all that gang that were in that little pub, let the Kent miners meet them as we've requested to meet them. We've requested to meet many, many miners in Leicestershire and in other coalfields.
But they know the arguments already, don't they?
No, they don't. Ottey and these people won't put the arguments to the miners. Jack Jones won't put the arguments to the miners. He won't let the Kent miners meet the Leicestershire miners. We've invited Leicestershire miners, Nottingham miners into Kent to discuss the matter, and they've killed it. They don't intend the Kent miners being able to meet their miners and put the case to them. If we did, if we could meet the people, we would let them see that they've not got the right to put a cross on a bit of paper and thereby sack a Kent miner.
You've been guilty of a kind of censorship, Mr. Ottey, up there.
It's rather remarkable to me that Jack should claim that when in fact 800 pickets at Cadley Hill Colliery in South Derbyshire today, picketing my members and Kentoon's members, have not been able to persuade the 400 or 500 people who wanted to go into that pit that they shouldn't go into it. Now that to us is a form of intimidation. We stand foursquare behind the democracy of a national ballot which was laid down by our forefathers. They recognised that we, as representatives, were no different to them. I was a miner, Jack Collins was a miner, all of the people at the meeting today were miners, but that doesn't give us a right to take away from our members their right to a democratic vote. They should be able to determine their future.
Can the strike go ahead, do you think, Mr. Collins, with the divisions which have emerged so clearly today?
Yes, Roy Ottey and his gang represent a very, very few number of miners. They represent the minority of the miners in this industry. Roy Ottey represents very, very few miners. Lorry drivers and various other people in the industry are the sort of people that he represents. Yes, the strike can go on. Many people in the British working class and trade union movement are supporting us, and to their eternal shame, to the eternal shame of Ottey and his gang, they're stabbing other miners in the back when other workers are supporting us.
Jack Collins, thank you very much indeed. And Roy Ottey, thank you also for joining us from Nottingham.
This is the News at 1 from ITN with Leonard Parkin.
Hello, good afternoon. There have been more confrontations with the police on the miners' picket lines, and the TUC has condemned the violence the first time it stepped directly into the dispute. There have been more clashes and confrontations between miners' pickets and police this morning, and for the first time the TUC has spoken on the issue, condemning violence from all sides. In a statement, the TUC General Council also criticised the massive police action in the dispute. Miners in Derbyshire and Yorkshire have again blocked major roads in the area in protest at being prevented from picketing pits. In Derbyshire, there were 48 arrests after miners blocked the A38 near Derby. Later, more miners tried to block the M1 near Chesterfield. Here's a report from Ken Rees.
So, for the third time in 2 days, striking miners had brought chaos to North Country roads. Drivers heading to work this morning on the A38 in Derbyshire faced long delays as pickets driving at a snail's pace forced traffic to fall into line behind them. Later, the pickets abandoned their vehicles and hundreds of police were called in to try to get the rush-hour traffic moving again. At one stage, fights had broken out between the pickets and other drivers frustrated at the delays. Derbyshire police say that 48 arrests were made. The county's Assistant Chief Constable described the action as criminally irresponsible. It took his men over 2 hours to restore traffic to normal. The pickets claim it's their response to the police tactics which have frustrated their efforts to get to the pits. But there has been criticism of the tough action taken by the police this morning. Mr. Tony Boff, a building foreman, was driving to work in Derbyshire this morning when he too was pulled in by the police.
Well, I approached this hard and I was instructed by a police officer to pull to the one side, which I did. He opened the car door, pulled my ignition keys out of the ignition socket, and got me by the shoulder and pulled me out the car. He then took me across the road, started to take me across the road to the police vans. There I asked him what I'd done. He didn't answer it by an answer. He just says, we're arresting everybody this morning.
We're arresting everyone?
We're arresting everyone this morning. So I said, well, I'm a general foreman for Cofton Construction. I'm on my way to work. He says, can you prove that? I says, yes, come back to the car. He spoke to me just as if I was a criminal.
What was your reaction to this?
Well, actually, fright. You know, he just frightened me. You know, I expected to be stopped, carrying 4 other chaps besides myself in the car with the trouble they've got, but not to be treated like that by the police.
And this was the scene on the M1 near Chesterfield this morning, where driving pickets again led a go-slow convoy down the road. Blocking all 3 southbound lanes, a huge traffic jam built up behind them. Police have warned that proceedings for serious traffic offences will be taken against anyone taking part in such a demonstration. Ken Rees, News at 1 in the East Midlands.
At Doncaster, more than 500 police officers ringed the Coal Board's area headquarters as pickets once again tried to close the building. Yesterday, 21 miners were arrested in fighting here. Today, the police had drafted in reinforcements from Cambridgeshire, Manchester and Lincolnshire. The office workers were led into the building. The 1,000 Coal Board staff formed a thin line 300 yards long as they were escorted into work. As the first of them reached their destination, the pickets tried to burst through the police ranks. The wall buckled, but within seconds reinforcements were there. We were then given a demonstration of police snatch squads. These men have been given specific targets, alleged ringleaders who've been singled out from the crowd. A few seconds later, the snatch squad was back with its catch. 12 demonstrators were arrested. Most will be appearing before special courts this afternoon. Paul Davis, News at 1 in Doncaster.
Well, as I said, the TUC has spoken out this morning against all forms of violence in the miners' dispute. It said it condemned the violence and in particular criticised police action. Our industrial editor, Giles Smith, is at the TUC.
Here at the TUC, the full General Council have just issued a quite unexpected statement on the miners' dispute. The NUM itself had not sought TUC support, and some on the General Council had hoped that the TUC would not get involved. But left-wingers forced the issue. They wanted the TUC to become identified with the dispute and the wider common struggle as they saw it. The statement says there's deep concern that the NCB, abetted by the government, is forcing through a programme of closures which will cause permanent damage to the mining industry. It goes on to call on the government to get all sides together for talks in view of the growing seriousness of the dispute. On picketing, the statement says, the TUC neither condones violence on picket lines nor accepts that there can be any justification in this or in any other dispute for strong-arm tactics by the police, which have grave implications for civil liberties. Well, that last sentence smacks of TUC compromise, no outright support for the flying pickets, and clearly the TUC does not want to be too closely identified with the sorts of scenes seen at some pits in the past few days. But no doubt the statement will be warmly welcomed by the striking miners. Giles Smith, News at 1 at the TUC.
This morning, the Coal Board said 3 fewer pits than yesterday are affected by the strike, 131 with 38 still working normally out of a total of 176. With me now is the Industrial Relations Director General for the Coal Board, Mr. Ned Smith. Mr. Smith, what do you think now that the TUC has lined up against you with the miners?
Well, have they lined up against us? The comment I've just heard is that they deplored the violence on the picket lines.
Certainly they've deplored the violence, but they've come out with the miners in their struggle against pit closures.
Well, I didn't read it as that way, in fact, in the statement just made. But the problem in our industry is this, that if the mine workers, by a majority, wish to take strike action, they're constitutionally entitled to do so.
Seems to me, and many others, many thousands of men in my industry who, like me, have not worked in any other industry, and I think to millions of people in the general public, the simple solution is for the National Executive to take, as has been the historic occasion with the NUM, a national ballot. If they decide by a majority to go on strike, that is what will happen.
But what is the NCB doing actively to bring this strike to an end? Apart from what you expect or hope the miners' executive will do, what are you doing?
Well, there isn't anything actively that we can do other than to maintain the pits open for work, to maintain that if men want to come to work, that work will be available, and this is what we're doing.
But surely there is something you could do. What we're seeing is illegal secondary picketing, which is leading to violence. Why don't you give a lead to those moderates in the industry who want to work by pursuing your action in the courts?
Well, we have already taken, as you know, initially an injunction against the flying pickets. That was at a time when they, in fact, were, by the actions taken, stopping men getting into work. Since that time, by the results of the action of the police, men are now able to go to work where they want to go. It seems to us that to start taking legal action will inflame the situation further, rather than maintain that circumstance which will encourage the moderates, a major expression of them yesterday at that meeting, to get the National Executive together to get a national ballot. It would be better to keep the momentum of spite down rather than raise it in order to get a national ballot.
But haven't they a right to look to you for a lead? Here they are, a lot of men want to work, the police are helping them to work, but the coal board seem to be doing absolutely nothing apart from hoping that somehow the miners' executive are going to vote for a national ballot.
The resolution to this situation is, in our opinion, and I think the majority of the workforce, indeed the majority of the workforce, the resolution is a national ballot. The National Coal Board cannot stop flying pickets. It could take legal action in the courts. The question is, would that stop it? It most certainly would inflame the present situation. That's in our judgment. What we want is, within our industry, some common sense industrial management, some common sense industrial reaction from the union.
Mr. Smith, thank you very much indeed.
The 9 o'clock news now with John Humphreys.
Transport unions join the miners' battle. They're offering to black the movement of all coal. Good evening. The miners have tonight won new support from some of the country's most powerful unions. The leaders of 6 unions have decided that there should be a total ban on the movement of coal. They represent railwaymen, seamen, dockers and lorry drivers. And if their recommendation is accepted, it'll be a big escalation of the dispute. The miners' president, Arthur Scargill, says it'll strengthen the resolve of miners already on strike. And the leader of the steelmen, Bill Sears, said it would leave most steelworks without coal within a fortnight. The ban could come into operation next week. John Fryer was at this evening's meeting in London.
The leaders of the main transport unions have been backing the miners, but it hasn't made much difference so far or any real impact on industry. But tonight they went much further than expected, as the miners' president explained.
The trade unions who were represented here today fully understand the situation in the mining industry, and having taken cognizance of that situation, have given the assistance that you've heard about. I must say that I'm delighted with the assistance that's been offered, and naturally it demonstrates the solidarity of the trade union movement. Those facts will be related to our membership, and I'm quite certain that it will strengthen the resolve of miners currently involved in national and area disputes within the mining industry in an attempt to save pits and jobs.
Tonight's decision lifts the dispute onto a different plane. Before this, the railwaymen had simply been asked not to cross picket lines. Now they'll be stopping all movement of coal, whether or not the miners themselves keep on digging it. But the most immediate impact's on the steel industry, the most vulnerable coal user. No more so than at Ravenscraig in Scotland. Workers there, worried about the future of the plant, had been asking miners to allow in enough coal to maintain production. The steelmen's leader went along with the decision, but he didn't seem too happy.
My instructions will remain the same as they have been. The implications of what has been decided here tonight, obviously my colleagues are aware of what I've said to them, and they're being aware of that, going in this direction, and my executive will discuss the implications. I'll call a special meeting next week.
Though the steel men have misgivings, Mr. Scargill got considerable unanimity here tonight, even though the miners themselves have considerable disagreements about the dispute.
It's in our interest. I mean, we cannot afford to let the miners lose this strike. It will put us back to 1926, and God knows whether we'll ever recover. We recovered after 1926, but it will be doubtful if we recover after 1984.
Picketing outside the coalfields has already started. The main target today was again the electricity supply industry. A power station near Doncaster was picketed, so was the nearby one at Drax. That was peaceful enough, but there were scuffles at Blythe in Northumberland and 24 arrests were made.
Some of the Yorkshire miners who've been arrested at the Nottinghamshire picket lines have accused the police of questioning them about their political affiliations. The men say they were asked how they'd voted in elections and how union money was spent. They've also complained that detectives would not identify themselves. The MP for Pontefract and Castleford, Geoffrey Lofthouse, says he'll be raising the matter in the House of Commons.
The miners were arrested near Silver Hill Colliery in Nottinghamshire and charged with obstruction. But it was the individual political cross-examinations that incensed them.
She asked me why I voted Labour. So I replied that I'm a working class lad and I believe the best party for working class. So then he says to me, well, if there were a Communist Party and a Conservative Party next general election, who would you vote for then? So I says, I think I'd have to vote for Communist Party. And he just says, oh, you would have to, wouldn't you?
Did we vote for Arthur Scargill, what we thought of Arthur Scargill? For me, what that's got to do with them is beyond me.
Did you complain about these sort of questions?
No, we didn't know who they were. They didn't even say who they were, we had no idea what they were at all. Just thought they were out of order, what they did. They took photographs of us, individually, with policemen nodding his arms, you know. And just with an ordinary Polaroid camera. Well, we want to know where these photos have gone to, who's got these photos.
Would you accept that they're entitled to question your political views, or his political views, or the technician's political views, if he was in an industrial dispute? I suggest that he is not entitled to ask political questions from anyone. The ballot box is supposed to be secret.
Nottinghamshire Police said the questioning of the pickets was routine, but a spokesman agreed that questions relating to the wider issues of the miners' dispute might have been asked.
The government has said it will pay for police operations during the miners' strike. The Environment Secretary Patrick Jenkin announced today that local councils wouldn't have to meet the costs.
In the studio tonight, Mr. Arthur Scargill, the President of the National Union of Mine Workers. He's the man who over the years has campaigned and gone close to strikes for better pay for the miners and for fewer pit closures. So for him tonight, it is all happening. Mr. Scargill, given that many of your union officials want to have a national ballot over the strikes, have you any intention of recalling your national executive before its normal meeting on April the 12th?
What I intend to do is to carry out the instructions of the National Executive Committee, and that decision was unanimous at its last meeting, and that is to give consent to those areas that are currently taking strike action to have that action declared official, and of course to recognise that we still have national action in progress. To also reaffirm that it's the union's total opposition to pit closures and the determination of Mr. McGregor and the Coal Board to impose those closures upon us that has brought us into this position. And that's the reason that we're now facing probably the greatest crisis since 1974.
Inside your union?
No, inside the industry and inside the nation, I would have thought.
Now, what about those union officials in the many regions who have said that they would like to have a national ballot? There are regions which have balloted their own members. Do you think they're now part of an anti-union group?
I think there has always been various points of view inside the National Union of Mine Workers, and indeed inside any trade union. But there is one voice of total unity, and that is opposition to pit closures and the programme put forward by Mr. McGregor. And I think we should remember that it was Mr. McGregor's statement of his intention to close over 20 pits and to make over 20,000 men redundant that sparked off the present controversy. And when one examines the stewardship of Mr. McGregor in the first 6 months, it really is devastating. It's cost the British taxpayers over £500 million so far, as a consequence of his bulldozing tactics and attempt to steamroller the mining industry into a pit closure program. And that's what's causing the dispute and the problem in the mining industry today.
Now, you say there's one voice, but aren't there two voices and perhaps many more? I mean, what do you say to the miners who have voted to go on working and who wish to go on working? You gave them the chance to vote. Why don't you let them adhere to their own vote?
Well, let me first of all give it clear expression. The National Executive Committee were not asked for any rights to vote in individual areas at all. What we were asked to do was to give authority and permission to areas who wanted to take industrial action, and that was given unanimously. And that's the position of the National Executive Committee today. As far as we are concerned, we are aware that every area of the NUM, as far as I'm told anyway, have said that their members should not cross picket lines. And traditionally, of course, our members have been involved in actions in previous years and said to members, look, will you support us in this action? And I find it absolutely astonishing in 1984 that we have to have 10,000 police in the Nottinghamshire and Midlands areas, something like a paramilitary state. Indeed, if this was happening in Poland, I've no doubt that it would be splashed all over the front pages of national newspapers and appear on ITV and BBC as well.
Nevertheless, in 38 pits consistently over the past 10 days, men have gone to work against your views. Now, the media are not bribing them to go into work. The police are not forcing them to work. Why are they crossing your picket line?
Well, with respect, what the media are doing is everything in their power to try and divide the National Union of Mine Workers, to try and drive divisions into that organisation. As far as we are concerned, we make it absolutely clear that there is already national action. And this seems to escape the attention of the national media for some reason. We've had a national overtime ban for about 23 weeks. It's cost the National Coal Board over 10 million tonnes of lost production and well over £400 million in lost revenue. That's been devastatingly successful. But at the same time, it was Mr. McGregor's decision to close at least at 20 pits and make redundant over 20,000 men that sparked the current controversy. And I must make the point that we in Britain do produce the cheapest deep mine coal in the world. And it's a travesty that we're seeing pits threatened with closure. If we were to receive the same state aid as is given in the communist bloc or is given in Western coal-producing nations, then our industry would be making for the British taxpayer today about £2,300 million profit.
Well, now, there are a number of points that you make there, Mr. Scargill. First of all, in fact, deep mine coal in the United States and Australia is cheaper than deep mine coal here. And equally, in Europe, where, of course, they're quite agreed, there are subsidies to the French, Belgian and German mines. But, of course, those are countries which don't have oil, which you don't produce in your equation. But what about the investment in future mines in this country? Could you compare that with Germany, France or Belgium?
Oh yes, you could compare all of those things, but let me first
Is
of all...
it not twice as much as in Germany and 20 times as much as in France?
Well, let me first of all correct something that you've said. It's not true that deep mine coal in the United States and Australia is cheaper than Britain. Indeed, if you take the subsidies into account in the United States of America, their coal is much more expensive from deep mining, and I'm not talking about...
Well, they'd be surprised to hear that, however.
Well, of course, they may be surprised to hear that, but it's a fact of life, and if you take into account the delivered price, it's considerably higher.
Well, wait a
When
moment.
we talk about the investment in this industry in Britain, of course we're having investment into Britain, but it's costing the mining industry an enormous amount of money. People in the media generally talk about the money given to the mining industry. It's just not true. We're paying up to 17% for the money that we are being loaned by central government. And it's costing the mining industry £2.2 million a day in repayments to the government in order that our industry can function. So that before we pay a penny wages, before we make a penny profit, we have to pay £2.2 million to the government. That can't be right.
Well, two things about that, Mr. Scargill. Isn't it true, first, that the government is going to pay you £1.1 thousand million, which will include those interest payments? And isn't it also true that 3/4 of the pits in South Wales and half the pits in Scotland, before interest is taken into account, already lose £10 for every metric ton that is mined?
No, it isn't. First of all, the government only gave us last year some £530 million in grants, and those were mainly grants to create redundancy or that type of benefit.
Yes, but in the coming year, is my figure wrong?
Yes, it is wrong. It's just over £600 million.
No, in the coming year, 1.1 thousand.
I'm sorry. No, it isn't. Your figures are wrong. You're talking about the total amount of money advanced to this industry, but you're not talking about the amount, which includes investment to this industry, which we have to pay back.
Which is even more.
I'm sorry, with respect, we have to pay back interest on that money. And that cost the miners a tremendous amount of money, some £366 million last year. And if you work that out, that's over £1 million a day in interest payments.
Is that
That's
not
astonishing.
included? Is that not included, Mr. Scargill, in the 1.1 thousand million pounds which is coming to the mining industry from the government? And is there not, on top of that, an investment coming in the next year of £854 million in new pits?
I think I've already made it perfectly clear that the money that's been advanced from central government contained last year only £530 million as a direct grant. And in the coming year, a little over £600 million as a direct grant. The rest of the money is not being given to this industry, and I reject that completely. It is money that's been advanced to this industry, either in the form of investment or in the form of aid, which has to be repaid. And it's got to be repaid at interest rates up to 17%. And we're having to pay that money when we could obtain on the open market money at about 9%. There's no way we can compete. We produce coal at £38 a tonne last year, and we compete with people in Western Germany that produce coal at nearer £50 a tonne. The only reason that they can compete with us is because they get a very substantial £25 a tonne subsidy from central government.
But West Germany isn't the real problem, is it, for you? I think at pithead prices it's £44 per metric tonne in this country, and the Australians and the United States can do it at £32.50. Now, it's not the Germans. The people who are bringing the imports in here, surely, are first of all the Poles from Eastern Europe who are desperate to get foreign exchange, and secondly, it's the United States and the Australians. I mean, the steel workers at Port Talbot, who this week have been unloading coal, have been unloading Polish coal and Australian coal.
Yes, but what you're failing to take into account with respect, and you've done it very neatly again, and I must put you right again, is you're quoting a pithead price, for example, in the United States, which is not correct.
I'm quoting prices at the port in Western Europe.
Yes, but what I'm telling you is this, that price in Western Europe is affected by the subsidy of the central government, whether it be in the United States, or let's take the government of Poland. The Polish government are reputed to be giving their industry up to £60 a tonne subsidy. They're virtually dumping it on the world market. Indeed, we're importing into the European common market over 75 million tonnes of coal, coal that ought to be supplied by British miners who produce the cheapest coal in the world.
Well, Mr. Scargill, we've gone over the figures, and maybe people have heard the figures. Shall we go back now to the men who are perhaps most concerned with this, which are your own members, who want to know what you are going to say? Now, shouldn't men who have voted to stay at work be allowed to continue at work without interference or intimidation?
The only intimidation and interference that I've seen are from 10,000 police who have been drafted into the Midlands area and Nottinghamshire area, which have turned that part of Britain into a paramilitary state, something that would have been unthinkable only a few years ago. The National Executive Committee of this union, and I repeat it for about the third time, have taken a unanimous decision to approve as official the strikes that are taking place in the British coalfield. And if one takes into account the individual ballot votes that have been conducted, say in the Yorkshire coalfield, where 86.3% of those who voted for strike action, it could be argued that there was an overwhelming majority of people indicating their support for the current action. You can't escape the fact that 80% of the miners at the present time are on strike. Neither can you escape the fact that 80% of the pits are not working. Those are facts of life. And in those circumstances, miners, and I can understand this, want to go and try to persuade other miners to join in those disputes. The National Executive Committee agreed to monitor the situation, and that's what the national officials will do.
Well, members of your National Executive say, on March the 15th, the Midlands President, Mr. McKee, we told him we wanted no Yorkshiremen picketing here. I wanted to ensure we have no blood spilt. On the same day, the Lancashire President, Mr. Sid Vincent, we fear some of our members may get maimed or even killed. And they're not talking about the police. They're talking about your other members.
The only person that I know that's been injured, badly anyway, in this dispute, was one young man who, unfortunately, was killed on a picket line in Nottinghamshire. I've certainly seen scenes of violence, but that has involved the police, contrary to your assertion. And I think with 10,000 police present in that area, it is bound to escalate the action. You see, my experience teaches me that where you do have a mass picket, you very seldom have any problems whatsoever. Saltley, in the 1972 dispute, is often quoted. Well, I happened to be at Saltley, and on the final day of that event, we had some 20,000 people there there were no arrests, there were no injuries and no problems, and we introduced a permit system which allowed the free flow of coal to pensioners and to widows and to hospitals and to schools and to needy people, those who actually needed it. And as far as I'm aware, that policy is being pursued at the present time by those areas who are actually taking strike action. And the national executive and the national officials will continue to monitor that situation.
But at Saltley, afterwards, you said you weren't playing cricket. And Mr. McGahey, on March the 6th, before the police really moved in to protect those who wanted to cross your picket lines and go to work, he said, "We are not dealing with niceties here." Mr. McGahey said, "We shall not be constitutionalized out of a defense of our jobs." Now, did that mean, and does that mean, you don't wish to obey parliamentary government, or the law?
Well, if you're quoting Mr. McGahey, I think the question should be directed to Mr. McGahey.
He's your vice president.
Well, of course he's my vice president, but you're quoting him, and I think that if you want to put,
Do you agree with him?
If you want to put a question to Mr. McGahey, you should put it.
Do you agree with him?
And as far as I'm concerned, I agree with the National Executive Committee decision. As president of the union, I carry out their policies. When you talk about police being on hand to ensure that people get to work, I only wish those 10,000 police officers were on duty every day, allowing the 25,000 jobs that are going to be lost in this industry a right to continue in operation. I only wish they were in operation every day to ensure that the 4.5 million people who currently haven't got a job could go to work. It's absolute nonsense when they talk about the rights of people going to work. This government have destroyed 4.5 million jobs in the past few years.
That's not quite the point, though, is it?
I think it's certainly the point.
No, what the police are doing, surely, Mr. Scargill, will be ruled by the courts as to whether it's legal or illegal, and the police will accept that ruling. Now, the Yorkshire mine workers have been ruled by the courts that they should not carry out picketing in other areas, and they have not accepted that ruling, should they?
As far as we're concerned, the Yorkshire miners or any other organisation within the trade union movement who exercise their traditional right to picket are carrying out the policy of the trade union movement. The TUC Congress decision is in favour of traditional picketing and totally opposed to the legislation introduced by the Conservative government. I think everyone's aware of the decision today by the other unions involved in transport who have agreed to black all movement of coal. They recognise that the attack on the mining industry is not merely an attack confined to miners. It's an attack confined to the broader issues involving jobs and the loss of those jobs. And that's the reason why they've decided to give tremendous support to the miners' union by blocking and blacking the whole movement of coal. I think that's tremendous, and I think it will give a terrific boost of confidence to the miners currently involved in both the national and area actions.
So you're going to stop the movement of coal, but of course the Electricity Board say that they've got enough coal. So if you're going to stop the movement of coal, isn't that really the coal to small people who actually burn coal in their own grates? That's the coal that's going to be stopped.
Well, as I understand it, the areas involved, and indeed the National Union, have always taken the view that schools and hospitals and ordinary people who are in need...
All ordinary people in need.
People in need would be guaranteed that those supplies could get through. But what would not be guaranteed is that industrial coal could get through. And we've been told today that the British Steel Corporation are in desperate need and they've only got about 1.5 weeks' supply left. It does seem to conflict with the public statements that were being made a few weeks ago that they got literally months of stocks available. And it also seems to conflict with the CEGB's position, because I'm told that they've only got something around 19 million tonnes. And if you take away about the 20% degradation of coal that can't be used, you're down to no more than about 9 or 10 weeks' supply. That's the reason for the hysteria, and that's the reason why the media are paying such particular attention to us at the present time.
If the situation for the steel workers is so serious, why is Mr. Bill Sears taking so long before he gets his executive to confirm the action which you're talking about?
Mr. Bill Sears was at today's meeting and also at the press conference afterwards, and you will have probably noted
it's been on the news
that Mr. Sears did not disassociate himself from that decision. And the people at that press conference were specific in ensuring that everybody at the meeting were entitled to speak. That decision was to block and to black all movement of coal in Britain, because the leaders of those unions involved recognise that the attack upon the mining industry and miners is something which is happening today that will happen to their unions and their members tomorrow. And that's my message to my members as well.
Was it not union flying pickets that really helped to elect Mrs. Thatcher in 1979?
No, I think it were people like you and Fleet Street who wanted desperately to have a Conservative government. You did everything in your power to to try and persuade the British people to elect a government that has produced a life of helplessness and hopelessness for 4.5 billion people on the dole queue, and produced a situation where young people have nothing to look forward to except permanent unemployment.
Isn't that just a little too glib, Mr. Scargill? Does that not, in fact, devalue the views of Labour voters?
No, it doesn't. And of course, when people say that the influence of Fleet Street in the media generally did something, it's not a glib answer, it's a fact of life. Let's not forget that we've had governments elected by the democratic process in the world which have turned out to be absolute disasters. We firmly believe that the election results, certainly in the last 2 general elections, were against the interests of the British people. And I think that more and more people, as days go by, are beginning to see the wisdom of that. The fact is that the British mining industry is now under attack. We are going to be reduced to 100 pits and 100,000 jobs. For the benefit of anybody watching, that means the loss of over 70,000 more jobs in this industry than we have at the present time. That's devastation as far as the mining communities are concerned. And particularly when you bear in mind, and I again repeat, that we do produce the cheapest deep mine coal in the world. We are the most sophisticated and technologically advanced coal industry in the world, and I've seen them both in the United States and the Soviet Union, and they can't even match our progress and our output levels. Last year, for example, output on the coal face in the mining industry increased by 22%. You can't call that something that's retrograde in terms of industrial development.
Mr. Scargill, you were the man who, in fact, opposed the payments to miners for increased productivity, and you were beaten by your own members. So perhaps you shouldn't argue that point too much.
And perhaps you should do your homework with respect. What happened was that we had an individual ballot vote that rejected the incentive scheme, the bonus scheme you refer to, by 55% of the votes cast. And the National Executive, led by Mr. Gormley and Sir Derek Ezra from the National Coal Board, circumvented that decision and said that the individual ballot votes of our members were of no consequence. It seems that Fleet Street refer to democracy when it suits them, doesn't it?
Well, you do too, don't you, in fact, because the
well,
boot
you're
is
the
now
one,
on the other foot.
Well, with respect, you're the one who are making the mistakes, not me.
Well, now, Mr. Scargill, I think a number of people will disagree with a number of the figures that you have given tonight, but all these can be checked. Is it possible that you've made a mess of this, that you've called this at the wrong time, with the winter ending, that you've divided your union as the mine workers have not been divided since 1926, and that you're now relying on other trade unions to get you out of a real difficulty?
Again, let me correct you. I haven't called anything. The National Executive at its last meeting, without any word being spoken by me or any recommendation from me, or indeed any national official, agreed to accept a proposition put forward by the Yorkshire NUM and the Scottish NUM to agree that the strikes being called in those areas would be declared official. And they were taken because Mr. Ian McGregor had announced a drop in output, comparing budget with budget, of 8.2 million tonnes in the forthcoming year. And that may include a loss, not merely of 20 to 25,000 jobs, it could include a loss of up to 40,000 jobs immediately, and certainly Mr. McGregor has confirmed that the long-term interests of the board see no more than 100,000 jobs in this industry and 100 pits. That's the sort of devastation that faces mining communities, and it's he who produced the situation that we now have, not me. I want to negotiate, he doesn't.
How many pits closed in Britain after your last mining strike in 1973-74?
Oh, the number of pits that closed after 1973-4, on average, were about 10 or 12 per year.
18 in the first year, surely,
Yes.
and 10 in the second.
Yes, but I'm talking about on average,
Yes,
between the 9 years.
I understand that.
And you see, the position is that in the plan for coal, which was adopted in 1974 and incidentally approved by the Conservative government prior to the 1979 election, they did agree to honour that and to put it into operation. The plan for coal did not envisage pit closures. It only envisaged closures due to exhaustion, something which we naturally accept. But the closure programme now taking place is not only closing pits which have got vast reserves of coal in them, but even closing units which are tremendously economic. We've just closed a coking plant in South Wales, which was making about £1 million to £1.5 million profit per year. That really is nonsense, even in economic terms.
What was the increase in productivity in the plan for coal in 1974 per annum?
Oh, the increase in the productivity rate has gone on.
No.
No, with respect, no, it's gone on from 1974, on average, by about 4 or 5%. But that's not been due to the incentive bonus scheme. It's been due to the innovation of new technology, something which we predicted and something which the Bradford Technology Group predicted in a major report, which, as I'm sure you're aware, has had very wide coverage indeed. So that was the reason for the productivity increases.
Mr. Scargill, the productivity was very slow to come through, and you didn't deliver it to the Labour government, even when Mr. Benn was in fact Secretary for Energy.
I'm sorry, but we did deliver the productivity increases. What happened was this. The reason that productivity in the mining industry over many years was in fact artificially held down was because of an appalling lack of investment by various governments. In fact, if you look through the 60s, over 500 pits were closed and around 500,000 miners lost their jobs and were sacrificed on the altar of so-called cheap Middle East oil. That policy was as daft as this policy is today. We are saying, remember the mistakes that you made, remember the fact that it cost the British taxpayers about £20,000 million more than it would have done to rely on British coal. Instead, they decided to rely upon imported oil. And today, there is no difference. We're still importing oil, incidentally, about 4 million tonnes of it, costing 30% more than British coal to generate electrical power. And if we changed that policy and began to develop and expand the mining industry and open new pits, then this industry could not only prove in the future years that it could produce the coal necessary, but at the same time could export coal all over the world.
Are there not pits now coming on stream as a result of the taxpayers' investment through the government, which will produce 24 metric million tonnes a year by 1987? Is that not some proof of the investment which has gone into your industry? And if you're worried about alternative fuels, what about socialist France, where communists sit in the government, where 40% of the energy requirements are now provided by nuclear energy, and it will be 60% by 1990?
You're talking, of course, about the French mining industry, where the chairman of the National Coal Board there resigned in disgust at the government's policy decision, and I agree with him totally. Of course,
it is a socialist government.
Well, I don't care what sort of government it is, whether it's Labour or Tory here or socialist there. If it's wrong, it's wrong. And it happens to be wrong in France, and it happens to be wrong here. Yes, it's perfectly true that we've got investment in the mining industry. Incidentally, the Selby coal field was first proposed by Arthur Scargill, not the National Coal Board. They replied by saying there was no coal there. That sort of policy is now coming to fruition. The tragedy is, it's not additional capacity. The Coal Board regarded it as replacement capacity. That's the major difference between the Coal Board and ourselves. If it was additional capacity, Britain would now be moving to produce 200 million tonnes of coal per year instead of moving towards producing 100 million tonnes.
But you're talking about cheap coal.